I can.
Right? Sounds good.
Awesome.
So, I'll start giving my arguments against God, and then we can go into your arguments for God. For people who are
Okay.
watching, we're going to have a discussion about whether or not God exists. I don't think God exists, obviously. It's named Deity Defeater. He does. So we're going to discuss that. All right. So my first argument against the existence of God is what's known as the problem of maximization. The argument is essentially that whatever goals God has, given that God is omnipotent, God could achieve those goals to whatever extent he desired. So, for example, if you had an omnipotent being whose goal was to just maximize the number of paper clips in the universe, that being would be able to make infinite paper clips. Likewise, if you had a god whose goal was to maximize the number of people who have a close relationship with him, you would make infinite people who have a close relationship with him without violating their free will. Whatever goals God has, God could produce them in infinite quantities. Over God, there aren't infinite people who have an infinitely close relationship with God, despite that being supposedly his goal, which proves that there's not a God, because if there were a God, his goal would be infinitely actualized. It's not, so there's no God.
Okay. And where you getting the idea that it's God's goal to have an infinite number of relationships with people?
Well, that was just an example of one goal that Christians give. They say his goal is to bring people as close as possible to God. But what do you think God's goal is? What does God ultimately want?
Well, the Bible states that ultimately creation is for God's glory. So it's just sort of something that he does because he pleases, as the Proverbs would say. He just sort of does what he wants.
Okay.
And yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily say that it's his ultimate goal to have as many relationships with people as he wants. More so that it's a goal, you know.
Sure. So, does God currently have infinite glory?
Does he currently have infinite glory? I don't know how you would quantify infinite glory. I don't think he does.
Well, okay. So, if God's goal is to have as much glory as possible, could God not just wave his fingers and just maximize his glory?
Sure, I don't think it's his goal to have as much glory as possible. I just was saying that his goal in making the universe was ultimately for his glory and not for any sort of like arbitrary relationship with his created.
Okay, but what is God's ultimate goal in life? If it's to just be as glorious as possible, and there are obviously better ways of doing that than making the universe.
I mean, the heck if I know what God's ultimate goal is. I have no idea there.
Right.
Yeah. So, but I don't think that like in saying God wants to have a relationship with people and God wants as many people as possible to choose him, I don't think that's the same as saying God's ultimate goal is to just have as many relationships as possible, like, you know, like he's some playboy or something. I don't think that that's the Christian worldview.
Sure. So would God want to have more glory rather than less?
Generally speaking, sure.
This probably, so then why not go poof, as much glory as is logically possible appear?
I don't know. I suspect that at some point he just gets, you know, diminishing marginal returns from his glory and feels like, you know what, I've got enough. I don't think that. I think generally he probably would want glory because it says he does things for his own glory. But
sure. So you say that God is omnibenevolent, correct?
Omnibenevolent, as in like all good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say that. I would.
Sure. So would an all good being, would that being's goal to be just to be as revered and glorious as possible?
Are you asking me, is that his goal or is it necessary that it's his goal?
Well, I'm asking, is that his goal? Because it seems to me that a perfect being's goal would not be to just be as glorious as possible. It seems like its goal would be to actually help improve the lives of people.
Sure. I don't see how we would get to the conclusion that that is his ultimate goal. I suppose you could say it's a goal. You know, like I go to the store for milk, but my ultimate goal isn't to go to the store for milk. It's just sort of a goal that I have.
Sure. So what is his? So you don't know what his ultimate goal is, correct?
I don't claim to know. No, sir.
Okay, sure. So this argument generally applies to people who say God has X specific goal. But so then the next argument, which I think applies more to people who don't have a specific view of what God's goal is the problem of evil.
I would say we can know that he has certain goals because he can say that he has those goals, but that doesn't mean that that's his ultimate goal. You know, like if I I want to get married and have kids, but that's not my ultimate goal in life, then, I can still say that I want this. But the fact that I don't take every single avenue that gets me there, like I didn't marry the first woman that I met, so to speak, doesn't mean that I don't have this goal. It just sort of means, it's not an ultimate goal. It's not the most important thing in my life that I would take any means necessary to get there.
Okay, sure. So, is there anything in the universe that is produced in infinite quantities, or in the logically maximal quantities, that could conceivably be God's ultimate goal?
I don't think there is I don't think there really is anything infinite that exists in the actual universe.
Right, but so God does have an actual goal, right?
He
We
might.
just don't know what it is.
I mean, he has sub goals, so I imagine it seems to me logically necessary. I mean, I haven't thought this through, but just off the top of my head, it would seem like if you have sub goals, you should have some ultimate goal. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense how you would get those sub goals in the first place. Like, where are you getting the motivation?
Right. So, but so if you say that whatever God's ultimate goal is, we know it's not produced in infinite quantities. Do you agree that beings attempt to maximally achieve their goals?
Yeah, sure. Beings, generally speaking, attempt to maximally achieve their goals. Yeah.
Sure. And God has the ability to infinitely achieve his goals.
Yeah, he does.
But God's goals are not infinitely achieved.
How did you get to God's goals are not infinitely achieved?
Well, you said that there's nothing that could. I asked you before if there's anything that could conceivably be God's goals that's produced in infinite quantities, and you said, no, I don't think anything could be produced in infinite quantities.
Sure. So maybe his goal isn't some arbitrary thing in an infinite or in a finite physical universe that he created. His goals could be outside of it. Like he could have an infinite number of paper clips, as you said, but just because there's no infinite number of things doesn't mean that he doesn't, doesn't mean that he hasn't achieved his goal.
Okay, so you think that somewhere outside the universe, there's just infinite of God's goals and just some nebulous like side space?
I wouldn't defend that. I'm just saying the fact that there's not an infinite number of something in the universe doesn't mean he hasn't achieved his goal. In fact, you could even say maybe his goal is to just have exactly one universe, and he is infinitely close to that goal because he achieved it because there's one universe.
Sure, but again, if you're presupposing that God is omnibenevolent, the goal of an omnibenevolent being is not to make just one universe, right? That's not their ultimate goal. Their ultimate goal is whatever is ultimately good.
Sure, but maybe what's ultimately good is exactly the value one universe. Like maybe it's a bell curve of goodness where 0 is bad and 2 is bad, but 1 is just right.
Wait, but why would the number of universes be morally relevant?
I don't know how any of what we're assuming is relevant. I thought it was just suppositions.
Well, sure, but so if you're saying that God is all good and God has this goal that is all good, and God wants to achieve it, and that goal has to be a good thing if God is motivated by omnibenevolence.
Okay.
Right.
So he has a goal and he wants to achieve the goal. Sure, yeah. He could achieve the goal, yeah.
And is there any moral, like normative value to one universe?
Is there any normative value to one? What do you mean by that?
Like, is there any reason why it is just like morally good to make exactly one universe?
I don't see why there's any reason beyond. I don't see why there's any reason for anything to be morally good aside from this is the goal of God, so to speak. Like, where would we get the concept of something being morally good?
Well, I don't think that God can reliably ground what is morally good because of Euthyphro's dilemma. If good comes from God, then if God said that you ought to torture infinite babies, then you would be obligated to torture infinite babies. Would you defend that?
I wouldn't defend torturing babies, but that's because God says not to torture babies.
Right, but if God had said to torture infinite babies, would you defend that you ought to?
Well, the problem with the Euthyphro dilemma is that we're essentially importing that something. If you distill it down to its most simplified version, it's essentially, what if God said this thing that's bad is actually good? Would that thing be good? The problem is that we're defining something bad before we're defining good, so it's an undefined attribute because bad is just the lack of good.
The distinction is that there is a strong intuition that people have that things like murdering babies is wrong. However, if you presuppose that good comes from God, then you would have to say that if God said that you should murder all the babies, then you should murder all the babies. It's a question of whether or not God is capable of grounding moral decrees, because if God is capable of grounding moral decrees, then anything that God says goes. If there are no external moral constraints on God, then God can say any moral claim and you would be obligated to follow it. If God said, go out into the desert, take a small child, and torture them for 40 years while cutting off like all of their limbs, you would be morally obligated to do that.
Sure.
Do you think that you would be if God had said that?
I think the question is, I think it's a logical contradiction in and of itself, because we're assuming that God is capable of making two contradictory moral laws, and
Okay.
and then we're reasoning to this conclusion, saying, hey, this is contradictory, therefore the thought of God is absurd. But it's really the premises.
Well,
Like,
can God? I mean, if goodness is just an arbitrary thing that we attach to God, divine decrees, then divine decrees can change. Like the same way that if God just makes a table, God can turn that table into a chair, presumably. If God makes one moral edict and then he says, "No, I'm tired of that one," he can presumably change it, right?
I think it would be fallacious to attribute sort of human contradiction to God's what we're calling word. It could really be some other.
You're the one
attribute.
who invoked it being logically contradictory.
Well, no. What I'm saying is that when we say suppose God says X, we're assuming that when God says something, it behaves the same way that a human says something. So if God says I like tacos, and then the next day he says I hate tacos, there's nothing logically contradicting about the concept of that, or so we think, because there's nothing logically contradictory about the concept of me saying those two phrases. The problem is that when you posit God as the source of all universal objective absolutes, you're essentially saying, suppose that the source of objective universal absolutes says something contradictory, then we get into a logical contradiction, because the source of logic is contradicting.
No, it's saying something that changes over time, right? So first he said one thing, and then he changed his mind and said something else. I mean,
you could make an algorithm, yeah, sure.
Well, you could imagine things that are correct that God creates, that are contingent truths, that are contingent on God, changing based on the will of God. So if God makes the universe, God could completely redesign the universe, and that wouldn't be a logical contradiction, even though they're both things that stem from God. If morality is the same way, it's just God says X, thus you ought to do X, then if God changes his mind about what you ought to do, then you have totally different moral decrees, and it's okay to kill babies.
Sure. So when I say God says X, I'm not defending the idea that God has to be creating morality and logic and mathematics and the laws of nature using like actual words. It's just a way of compartmentalizing in my brain the idea that God has defined these things. And I don't know if he does it with his nature, as some people will say, or if he does it with his kidney, for all I know. But the point is that it comes from God. So it's not necessarily that we can say, oh, what if God said not X, but he also said X? Wouldn't that give us this moral contradiction, this moral dilemma in ourselves, which is a contradiction with the laws of morality? And the answer is no, because we are presupposing one set of morality, and then we're examining this other set of morality. But this other set of morality can't exist if we're supposing the first set of morality. That would be a logical contradiction.
Sure, but it's not a logical contradiction if he changes from the first morality to the second morality. So if God originally makes the universe such that it's wrong to murder babies, and then he says, I'm changing my mind. I think it's okay to kill babies now, right?
Sure. So do you think it's a logical contradiction to ask, can God create a rock so heavy he can't lift it? Is that a logical contradiction?
Yeah, I think that is a logical contradiction.
Okay, because it's essentially the same thing. Instead of a contradicting law of nature, you're talking about a contradicting law of morality. You're saying, can God create good that's bad?
No, it's not saying that can God create good that's bad. It's can God make something that was at one point good that is now bad. So it's like saying, can God make a rock that is 500 feet, and then can he make it into being 1,000 feet? Well, it can't be both at the same time, but it used to be one. It became the other. No contradiction arises. Likewise, it used to be the case that one thing was moral, then God changes his mind. If good comes from God, then if God changes his mind, then what you ought to do changes based on what is presupposed to be good.
Sure. So when you say suppose a rock 500 feet long or however, we're not examining a law of nature. We're examining something within nature that just sort of manifests itself as the result of the laws of nature.
Well,
It
but
would
the
be
same
different
thing
if
would
we said suppose an entirely different set of universal objective absolutes. So the laws of morality aren't a manifestation of morality. They are the actual system that we're talking about. So
well,
it's
but
sort
the
of the same
same.
way if we were to say suppose God made a new law of logic. Can he just do that? Well, yeah, but that would be contradicting for our point of view because we're navigating logic to get there. It's the same way.
No. So, well, again, you said that it's analogous to a law of nature. So, if
Yeah,
that's true, like God could change the laws of nature, presumably. God could make gravity stop working, I would assume, right?
sure, but describing that coherently is a little bit difficult.
Well, but
Like,
again,
can
so
God? Let me here.
God,
Let me put it this way.
sure.
Can God make a red blue? Essentially, can God
No,
make the color
because
blue, but it's red?
no, so the distinction is that in that case, you're presupposing that something is P and not P at the same time. In the case that
Of
I'm
course,
giving,
exactly. Yeah,
you're saying no, but the distinction is, could God make in this case, it's in different points in time. So it's not can God make something that is good and bad at the same time. It's this thing that we think of as bad right now.
Mhm.
If God just changed the moral laws of the universe, could God make murdering babies moral?
Sure. It's sort of the same thing as this thing that we call red right now. Can God make it blue? It gets into really dicey kind of definitional language where if God just created a universe where all red things are blue and all blue things are red, there would be no logical problem with that. But if God sort of just takes red and makes it blue, that's a logical
Well,
contradiction. So it's sort of the
no, it's
same
not. I
thing.
mean, if God snapped his fingers right now and turned my shirt blue, and turned your shirt blue, and turned everything else in the universe that's red blue, and
Mhm.
turned everything that's in the universe that's blue red, no contradiction would arise.
Sure, but he wouldn't be making the red blue. He would be making the things that are red blue. In other words,
Right, and
because
in this
red's
case,
already been defined, we can't take it and then use the opposite to define
right,
itself.
and in
That would
this
just be a
case, he's making
contradiction.
things that are moral immoral, or things that are immoral moral. He's not making the morality immoral. He's making the things that are moral, or that are immoral moral.
So you're talking about not the process by which we achieve the values. You're talking about just straight up flipping the values.
Sure.
Okay. Then I mean, he could call it a different thing. Yeah, sure. That would be fine. But it
Well,
wouldn't
it's not a
be.
question of calling it a different thing. It's a question of there are moral absolutes, or there are moral rules. You
Mhm.
think that God could just make murdering babies okay?
I think if God created the universe with one of the constraints being the laws of morality, and one of the things he dictated in the laws of morality were killing babies were okay, there's no logical problem with that. But if what you're saying is, what if God right now snapped his fingers and said to us, killing babies is now good? That's a logical contradiction. God cannot physically do that. Or no, I wouldn't say physically do that. He can't coherently do that because you and I are in a universe in which one of the constraints on us is the laws of morality. And if
So
God
okay, so
is
God could
to
make
always
a
tell the truth, and then God is certainly telling us that killing babies is wrong, then that would be or is
okay,
right. That would be a
so you
contradiction.
think that God could make a universe that is identical to ours in every way, including our intuitions about morality. The only difference is that murdering is that all of morality is flipped. So it is morally okay to kill babies. Jeffrey Dahmer and Hitler are some of the most mortal individuals in history. Um, God, it could make a universe that's like a parallel universe of ours, but where the morality is flipped, but where our understanding of morality is the same.
You could say that it's logically possible, the concept of this, yes, but then at that point you would lose sort
And
of any
in that
ability to.
world, you would be morally obligated to stab out babies' eyes.
Sure, but then you lose all ability to say, God, what if God made bad things good? Because then bad wouldn't have been defined yet. You'd just be saying, what if God made good things good, but different
Well,
things were
but
good?
in that, so we don't know if we are in that universe right now because it's functionally identical to
I think
our
we know
universe.
that we're not in a universe where we kill babies. I mean,
Well,
or at
but
least that killing babies is not good. I mean, we
how
do
do we
it
know?
1 million a year, but
How do we know?
I mean, are you saying we don't know that we're in a universe in which like murder is good?
We know that we're in a universe where all of our logical faculties lead us to the conclusion that killing babies is not good. However, if morality is just caused by divine decree, it's possible that what God decreed at the start of the universe was exactly the opposite of what we believe morality to be.
Wait. You're saying we believe things in line with the universe, but how do we know that what we believe is not in line with what we believe? I don't understand the question.
No, I'm saying that it is correct. It is true that we believe that it is immoral to kill babies.
Mhm.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Hopefully we believe that.
More or less.
I tend to believe that.
Okay.
That you don't kill the babies.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. Babies are good.
Right. Sure.
Mhm.
So then the question becomes, so we know that we have the intuition that it's wrong to kill babies. However, if what morality means is morality is just a statement about what words God spoke, what decrees God wrote on divine piece of paper at the beginning of the universe, whether he wrote X,
just a constraint. Yeah.
yeah, whether he wrote X is bad or Y is bad.
Mhm.
From that, we do not have firsthand knowledge of what things God has decreed as being mortal or immortal. We have no way of knowing if in this universe it is mortal to kill babies.
Sure, we just sort of have this inductive reasoning where we can say it seems like this is what's true. Is it kind of what you're getting at?
It's not inductive, it's intuitional. But again, why should we think that our intuitions correspond with whatever God says?
I don't understand how that's any different a critique than if we completely take God out of the equation and we just sort of posit the good as this self-existent thing, and then say, how do we know that what we believe is good is actually good?
Because
like, how does God create this problem? I feel like
the distinction is that your view of where morality comes from is something that humans could never know, because it's the arbitrary whim of a divine being. That divine being could make it whatever he wants, and absent firsthand knowledge of what that divine being wants, we have no way of knowing what's good or bad. If God, when he made the universe, said that it's good for earthquakes to suffocate children, then you would have an obligation to make a bunch of earthquakes that suffocate children.
Sure. How do you get from the premise God says this to the conclusion therefore it's unknowable? Because it seems to me we know more or less all the universal objective absolutes. I mean, we know the laws of mathematics more or less. We know the laws of logic. We know the laws of nature, at least a lot of them.
Sure, because those are observable and testable, but we do not know the laws of morality that God wrote down on this cosmic piece of paper at the start of the universe.
Are laws of logic testable and observable? Like, how do you observe laws of logic?
Well, they're testable. Take me through that. Like, so they, first of all, they just are a intrinsic truth. Like, you cannot have P and not P based on what it means to be something. The law of identity stems from the very nature of a thing. Second of all, everything that we've observed...
That sounded like you were using a logical statement to talk about to justify logic. I'm asking you how you can observe logic.
Well, we can
can you observe logic without invoking
logical absolutes. Every single thing that I've seen has not been not that thing.
Okay.
So that's a very strong inductive case for a reason.
Everything that you've seen that has been a thing has not been not that thing. So this is sort of you would say an empirical proof for P is not P.
Well, you asked for sort of like inductive evidence for logic working. I gave you
empirical evidence, because if all rationality is the laws of logic, how do we only empirically observe the laws of logic? That's what I'm asking you.
Well,
I don't think it can be done.
Well, empirically, in the past, whenever I've seen a thing, it has not simultaneously been not that thing.
How do you know that the past will be like the future? Like, how do you know that just because you observe this, that there's some sort of pattern going on here that we can make empirical claim or empirical statements about?
Two things. One, the claim that because we have not proved that the past will be like the future, therefore there is no proof, is an inductive claim, which is using induction to disprove induction. Because I can just say, there is a proof, we haven't discovered it yet, but there is a proof somewhere. And for you to say, no, there isn't a proof because we haven't proved it yet, so there's probably not a proof, that relies on induction. So I can just say there's a proof out there in the ether. We don't know what it is, but for you to deny that there's a proof is an inductive claim, which concedes the validity of induction. Second of all, there is a very high probability that induction works, given that it's worked in the past. If we say that the prior probability of induction working versus not working starts out at 50-50, but in a world where induction doesn't work, the odds are 99.99999999999% that induction would have stopped working in the past, we can conclude that we are almost certainly in a world where induction works.
Sure, but how would you get the sort of laws of logic used in
We
order
can
to
prove them through induction, as I like.
So you would use induction to prove induction. In other words, how is that not like begging the question a little bit?
Well, no, it's not using induction to prove induction. It's using induction to prove deduction.
To prove the laws of logic to prove induction.
It's using induction is an empirical and evidential claim, right? We're using that to prove the laws of logic.
Yes,
we can. It also like the laws of logic are just things that intrinsically exist. Like 1 + 1 = 2 in all universes. It cannot equal 3.
Okay. Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm with you there, but I'm saying like, if in order to observe the laws of logic, you have to presuppose things like induction. How are you observing the laws of logic? Because induction is part of the laws of logic. Like, in order to make any sort of application about my observation, I have to be able to rationally compartmentalize the thing that I'm looking at. I don't physically see the law of logic float past me. And then
sure,
go,
so we know that it exists because when we conceive of what it means to be a thing, that thing is bound by logical constraints. When we conceive of what it means to be a thing, it stems from that it cannot be not that thing. It's not coherent to say a thing could both be itself and not itself.
Well, sure, but examining coherency in order to prove is a purely rational proof. It's a reductio ad absurdum.
Right now, you're just sort of being like giving a bunch of arguments as to why we're skeptical about our very base axioms. I don't think that that's especially relevant to the conversation, because I think that anything that you can be skeptical about logic, you can still be skeptical about those things if God exists. But I have another argument that's kind of similar, which is just it's an old tried and true one. It's the problem of evil. There's a God.
Okay.
Why are there earthquakes that suffocate babies to death? Why are there flesh-eating parasites that make it so huge chunks of people's faces are devoured to the bone? It seems like a bad design that a perfect being wouldn't make. Why does a perfect being make it?
What's wrong with that design?
Because it causes suffering.
Okay. What's wrong with suffering?
Well, okay. So if you're arguing, do you think that it's bad when kids die of malaria?
I think it's bad that kids die of malaria. Sure. Yeah.
Sure. So I'm glad
like
we
it's
agree
my
about
opinion,
that.
though, in your worldview.
Well, no. Okay. So separate issue. The issue of how I ground morality is a separate issue.
Yeah,
we can get to that in a second. But you and I both agree that malaria is bad. Whether or not I can ground that malaria is bad, that's a separate discussion. You can bring it up when we get around to talking about the arguments you have for God, right? So we agree that malaria is bad. Why does God make malaria?
Sure.
Why does God make flesh-eating parasites?
Before I answer that question, do you think that if we all got together and we said, like, we all agree that something is bad, that makes it bad? Like, for example, if we all agreed together killing Jews is a good thing, would that make it a good thing? And then we'd be able to ask God, hey, God, why can't we kill Jews? You know, like.
No, I don't think that makes it good.
Okay, so then I don't see how challenging like a theonomous moral worldview with sort of heteronymous dictates is really a good argument, because
that was
at
an
the end of the day, even if we
comprised sentence.
I thank you.
But so again, the question is, why make malaria? We can have the discussion about how I ground morality in a second. But given that I think malaria is bad and you think that malaria is bad, for this conversation, until we get into the discussions of meta-ethics and how I ground it, for now, let's agree that malaria is bad. Why does God make bad things?
I can agree that I think it's bad, and that we both think it's bad. But
right, so
I don't know how we can say, just outside of the acceptance of the existence of God, how we can say we agree that morality is certainly objectively bad. Like I didn't prove to you just now malaria. Did I say morality was bad? Yeah, I didn't prove malaria was bad. I just said I think it's bad.
Sure.
Like, I don't see how God has to come down and say, hey, you think this? Well, let me tell you how you're wrong. Like, it's just sort of, you know, if it's only something we both believe, I don't see how that's a logical problem.
So is your answer to the problem of evil that these things are not actually bad? Like malaria is
No,
fine.
I'm just asking, how did you get the problem of evil? Like, what problem is essentially
We can
the
get into
question.
metaethics in a sec, but that just seems to be a pretty big diversion. Like
Mhm.
that argument is analogous to me saying like, okay, if there's a god, why does this happen? And then you say, well, how do you know anything if there's no god? It's just a totally separate issue, and we can talk about it in a sec. But if we
Sure.
agree that malaria is bad, why does God make malaria?
Well, and I can answer that, but it's sort of like if you were to say,
Then do so.
like, if God exists, why is my scooter red? Like, it just sort of becomes an arbitrary question if we don't ground it in anything. So I just kind of wanted to underline that first. Like,
Sure,
I can answer the problem.
Let's put a
of evil
pin in the
as best
discussion
I
of
can.
metaethics. We
Okay,
can discuss that in a second. But so for now,
So just assume bad
We
things are
assume-
objectively bad,
well,
and
we-
if
yeah,
God
we
is
assume-
good, why
sure, we
do the
assume-
bad things happen?
yeah, let's assume malaria is
Under his
bad, flesh-eating
domain.
parasites are bad, etc. Why does God
Sure.
make them happen?
Sure. I mean, I still don't know. Like, I assume he just wants to. I don't see that there's this logical obligation where if bad things are bad and God is good and God has the ability to make bad things not happen, then therefore God will always make those bad things not happen. I don't see how we
So
arrive
can
at
it-
that conclusion.
Can a perfectly good being do bad things?
Can a perfectly good being do bad
Do
things?
immoral actions?
Objectively bad things, no.
Okay, is malaria? You said we agree for now.
Yeah,
for the purpose of
suppose
conversation,
malaria
that malaria is objectively bad, so
Sure.
God could not make it.
Sure, yeah, okay. God
Right,
could not.
So then you cannot explain why malaria exists.
I can't explain why malaria exists.
Yeah, if there's a perfect
I already
God, why
can't
does malaria
explain why
exist?
malaria exists. I don't see how that's a problem.
Well, why does God? So there are millions of instances of evil in the world, none
Sure.
of which can you explain, like earthquakes that suffocate children. Why does that exist? Malaria, flesh-eating parasites, etc. Why does God make?
Why
any
do
of
they
those things
exist?
Yeah, why does God
evil
make them?
exists as an absence of good? So, in any instance that something deviates from goodness, evil is just sort of necessary. It's sort of like darkness existing as separate from light.
Okay.
I don't-
So
I don't
sure. So
understand. Yeah.
But why does God make things that are evil?
Why does God make things that are evil? Like the creation itself is the evil, or the thing can have evil as an attribute?
Well, I mean, I think creating malaria is evil, right? Like if I made malaria in a laboratory that killed millions of kids, that would be evil, correct?
Sure. Yes.
Yeah.
But
So then the creation of malaria is evil.
I don't think that's the same thing as creating something that has the capacity for it to be evil.
It's not creating something that has the capacity for it to be evil. It's creating something that definitively will be evil because God's supposedly omniscient and that will kill millions of kids. Why does God do that?
But just because you know something, that doesn't make the thing. It doesn't make the thing inevitable, so to speak. Like if we were to go back in time,
does malaria like have free will and made the bad choice that became?
I would not defend that argument. But
so then how is it not predetermined? God made a disease. The predictable effect of the disease would be millions of deaths. Why did God make it?
Sure. So I wouldn't say just because you know something that makes that thing necessarily inevitable. Like if we were to go back in time and observe, Hitler's youth growing up, and then he becomes evil and does, Holocaust
right, because that's
and
a
there goes
human
11 million
system.
people.
Yeah, because that's a human system, and humans can be changed based on external factors to the extent that you believe in free will, which I don't. But I don't think
you don't believe in free will.
No, but that's a separate discussion.
I'm going to exploit that later.
Okay, cool. I don't think you can ground free will either. But
you don't think I can ground free will?
Okay, that's a separate discussion. Back to the problem of evil. So the distinction is that in that case, creating Hitler was not necessarily like immoral, and I suppose you would say, because Hitler had the potential to not be evil. It was his choice. But malaria does not have the potential to not be evil. Malaria does not have free will. Malaria does not have a will. It's a disease. Why did God make it?
So then malaria itself wouldn't be bad. It would be the effect that malaria has on people causes suffering, and suffering is bad, is essentially what you're saying. Suffering is not ideal.
Yeah, well, if you make something that has a bad effect on people, then that's bad. If I make malaria in a laboratory and it kills millions of kids, that's bad.
Sure, okay. And then, so if God, why would we specifically pick malaria? What if we picked something much more mundane, like say God just makes somebody and eventually they'll die? Is that immoral? Because generally speaking, making somebody die.
Because malaria is one instance that's more like the other things, like the eventual death of a person there is potentially some explanation for it. I don't think that the explanation suffice, but I'm picking some of the things that I think are the most difficult to explain.
Mhm.
Some things that I think are the most difficult to explain are children dying afraid, sad, and alone as they die of hunger and thirst and sickness. I don't think you can explain why a perfect God would make that.
Sure. So the reason I'm talking about somebody eventually dying is sort of to distill the problem into an area where it's easier to recognize kind of the problem we're running into. When you say causing somebody to die is generally bad, it's generally bad because we're talking about it from the perspective of somebody putting harm on someone else that they wouldn't otherwise have. When we're talking about God can't put harm on someone that they wouldn't otherwise have, because otherwise there would be no someone, at least conceptually speaking. So, like, I mean, the Bible's explanation for this would just be like, can a guy make one pot of clay to throw trash into and another for, his pretty shelf? Like, yeah, he can do whatever the heck he wants,
Yeah,
He's
that's because pot of clays are not sentient. If there
Even
was
if they were.
well, okay, if a pot of clay could feel pleasure and pain, and you caused a pot of clay to be tortured and suffer and die, would that be immoral?
If you were the creator of the universe, it would not
If you were
be
the
immoral.
creator of the pot of clay, would that be immoral? So is it mortal, if I had kids, would it be mortal for me to torture my kids if I'm the creator of them?
Sure, I wouldn't say you're the ultimate creator of them. I'd say, you help move stuff around a little bit. I mean, your wife would be a little more the creator, but I wouldn't say you're the ultimate creator of the thing.
So let's suppose that I am that there's a universe. I'm the only being in that universe. I'm essentially a Boltzmann brain. I just materialize. No God brought me into existence. I just materialize in the ether.
Never mind the logical problem with that. Okay, yeah,
right. I make a child. Single-handedly. I'm just that cool. I just single-handedly make a child.
Pretty cool.
Would it be mortal for me to
I need a girl
torture that child for 40 years before murdering them? I am their ultimate creator.
What would be wrong with you torturing a conceptual child?
Wait, so you would be okay if you were the ultimate creator of that child with just stabbing the child every day of their life until they die?
Don't you do that all the time when somebody
pisses
you off in traffic?
Children.
You don't just in your head go stab, stab, stab. It's just me. Like, I create a conceptual person and I torture them sometimes. Maybe I'm letting out too many dark secrets here, but I don't see
maybe you are, but again, that person
value.
Is conceptual. They don't actually exist. In this case, this is a real person who exists.
Well, you said that you're just a floating brain, so I imagine you're not drawing any distinction between conceptual and actual existence. So they just sort of are.
No.
And you're just sort of torturing.
Sorry.
What would be the difference?
Well, no, sorry, you misunderstood the example.
Yeah,
I might not have been clear enough. So just to explain, so the example is, so we presuppose this universe of just swirling particle soup, and from that swirling particle soup, a being comes into existence. That being.
Okay.
That being is
a little bit logically dicey.
Well, it's not logically impossible. It might be practically impossible, but so that
I'd say it's logically impossible because
that being pops
suppose free will, and free will supposes something other than strictly material.
Sure,
but
we can get to the logical problems with abiogenesis in a sec. But so that being pops into existence, and that being is yo, cool. I have arms. I can move around. I exist. I'm gonna make a kid now. So he makes a kid.
That's what I did the first moment I realized I had arms too. I was like, "Whoa, I want a kid."
Yeah, sure. So, and he's able to make a kid just because he has, universe superpowers from having been materialized into existence, etc. So he makes a kid. This is a real child. Child can feel pleasure and pain.
What do you mean it's a real child?
This child, it's not just something in its head. It's a real thing that exists. It is a sentient being.
Are you saying the thing exists actually rather than just purely conceptually?
Yes.
Okay, so how do you define actual existence outside of a god? Because I was under the impression that actual existence is distinguished from conceptual existence, and that we put these universal, objective, absolute constraints on this child as attributes. And if that's the case, one of the things we'd be putting on this child would be morality, in which case it would be wrong to torture the child.
I think that actual existence would be things that correspond with external reality. So you actually exist. A made-up idea in my head of unicorns doesn't actually exist.
So this mind has created
Well, no, this is not a
actual
mind.
existence.
This is like a guy who
This guy has created actual existence separate from just
like
purely conceptual.
this guy, he's able to asexually reproduce, so he's able to just have a child with himself. Let's not get into the details.
Wait. He can asexually reproduce, so he has physical form. So he exists actually.
Yeah.
So he's not creating the actual universe. He's just creating a thing in the universe. The universe already exists, and he exists physically, materially. He's not a concept, is what you're saying.
He exists materially.
Okay.
He just popped into existence.
Sure.
As a result of universe particles swirling around.
Okay. So there was already a universe with these constraints on it, such as laws of logic, mathematics,
in
morality,
this hypothetical, right? This universe was not created by God.
Okay.
Then
the universe was not created by God. The universe is it self-existent? How do we get?
Yeah, the universe just exists. It's just a thing.
It just exists.
Yeah, this is a hypothetical.
So like, well, I understand, but if your question will ultimately be, is this okay? Is this morally acceptable? I think that where the universe comes from is probably the most important question, because if this is a concept, then we're talking about something in conceptual reality that has no actual attributes, and therefore you can't say that it's actually wrong. But if we're talking about it exists actually already, then it would have the laws of morality. There wouldn't be a moral dilemma.
Sure. So this universe arose, no God, just there were some particles swirling around. They had been doing that for all of eternity. They hit each other in a certain way. Bam! Human pops out. And he says, I'm going to make a baby. So he makes a baby.
So the universe, is this just a is this like a infinite regress caused universe? That sounds like a bit of a logical problem.
So, like, for the purpose of this hypothetical, so I assume you would disagree with the possibility of that by making the
definitely
argument, but we can't go into every argument in response to every hypothetical, right? So
I understand, but this would be my objection to your question, is essentially how you get the universe is how you get the attributes, which is how you get the morality. So if you're going to ask me, how is this moral? I would say, well, how did we get here, so to speak?
Well, so he just popped into existence from swirling particle soup that has existed for all of eternity. Okay, so, and then he says, I'm going to make a baby. Can he torture his baby, morally?
Morally speaking, depends where you would get the morality. Like, where are you importing this morality from?
Well,
is it an attribute?
Do you think that it would be okay for him to torture it?
Well, right now I don't think anything him, because I don't think he's logically possible. I think it's a contradiction to even suppose him. Like, if you're going to ask me to make this moral statement, I would ask you to import like the morality that we're using first. Otherwise, it's just this library that I'm citing to that doesn't exist.
Okay, sure. I mean, I don't think it's logically impossible, but sure. Why does it matter whether or not, like, if whether or not you create something, why does that matter in terms of you mistreating them and causing them suffering?
I don't think whether or not I create. Are you going back to the God created this person so God can destroy them kind of a thing? Is that
so God can like cause them to suffer immensely and die?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, God can do whatever he wants, and there's no.
So why does it follow from if you made something that you can treat them however you want?
Well, sure. If you made the entirety of the thing, the entire concept of the thing, rather than just the physical parts of the thing, then it would follow that if one of those attributes being morality, then there'd be no moral dilemma with you doing anything to that thing, because you've set the rules of how that thing can be interacted with. Like, if I made a program and I said I can hit any key on the keyboard to control this little guy on my game, then there'd be no like programmatically, there'd be no error with me hitting a key that doesn't do something, because I made them all okay. Like, I can set whatever keys I want to do.
But if you made a program, if you made a computer program, and that program had real sentient beings that were able to feel actual pleasure and pain, that were able to actually suffer, it was essentially importing, like, basically the equivalent of a human mind into a computer program. No matter what you wrote in the code in terms of what you said when you were creating the program, what you said morality would be, it would still be wrong to torture those people in the game, right?
Sure. And first of all, I think that would be scientifically impossible. But
okay.
Second of all, once you start talking about putting a human mind, you're importing this human library, and one of the things about humanity is human value. It's the image of God. So you're essentially saying, create this thing and put the image of God in it. Well, if I'm creating it, where am I getting the image of God? I'm not God. So I'm not creating the whole thing. I'm creating some of it, and then I'm putting this other thing in it.
This is not literally a human mind, but it's a mind analogous to a human.
Sure.
If it would pass the Turing test, it is able to have experiences the same way a human is, but it's not literally a human being imported. Would it be wrong to
value,
torture?
Or does it not have moral value?
Well, I think it would if it's able to feel pleasure and pain. Would it be wrong to torture it?
Let's say, suppose it has a moral value, then yes, it'd be wrong to torture it.
No, I'm not supposing it has moral value. I'm asking you. You program this thing. It's able to feel pleasure. It's able to feel pain. It's an AI, essentially. Would it be wrong to torture it?
Are you essentially asking me, if I created an AI that can feel pleasure and pain, would it have moral value?
Yeah, would it be okay to torture it?
I think it would be... Wait. Is it... whether or not it's okay to torture it comes entirely from whether or not it has moral value. So if you're asking, if you're saying suppose it does or does not, that would be the answer. But if you're asking me, does it have moral value?
No, I'm not supposing it has moral value or doesn't. I'm asking, does it have moral value?
Okay, so that would be more of a scientific question than a logical question.
Wait, why would that be a scientific question? In this
you're essentially asking me, is it scientifically possible, or given these material constraints about the way this program behaves, would it have moral value? I don't know everything about the material
in this
world
hypothetical, its mind is sufficiently similar to a human that if it was implanted in a human body, it would act basically exactly like a human.
Okay.
Except it would eat its corn on the cob this way rather than sideways. But other than that, its mind would be exactly the same as a human. Would it be okay to torture it?
If the mind is exactly the same as the human, at least in my view, part of this being, one of the attributes would be the laws of morality, the image of God. So if you somehow found a way to write that program, then it would be wrong to torture it.
Great. So then you agree that regardless of what you say in the computer program, it is still wrong to hurt sentient beings.
Only if you can actually physically import an image of God into a computer program, which at that point you're not making the program, you're just importing it from GitHub, basically. So it's not your program, it would be somebody else.
Wait, why is it like you're the one who programmed it?
Well, I mean, if I program something, but I took a whole library from somewhere else, then I'm using their code, and I'm just sort of doing a little bit of moving around with it. I didn't actually make the whole thing. I didn't create the ones and zeros in the machine language.
Okay, so
I wouldn't say I don't think it's logically possible to say I create this being from nothing, because if I'm assuming that it's like a human and I'm putting these human attributes into it, then I'm taking the human attributes out of a thing that already exists. That's humanity. We didn't make humanity. So if you're saying, imagine you create a human.
So your answer to the problem of evil is that because God made us, he can do to us whatever the hell he wants.
Well, yeah, I would just say, what problem of evil is really the question. What's evil about doing something?
Okay, so that relies on the idea that God makes morality. So God can, because he makes morality, God can make it so that morality is whatever he wants.
I would say morality is this attribute that he puts on his creation. And so if he puts this moral constraint of you can't kill this guy, then you can't kill that guy, so to speak. Okay,
so no matter what God does, even if God tortured 5 million kids, that would be morally okay.
I mean, yeah.
As long as he made the system.
Sure, I don't know why you're calling them kids when, I mean, that sounds like you're importing a moral kind of intuition. You're making an appeal to morality, so to speak.
I'm making an appeal to intuitions. I mean, sure. So
yeah, so my intuition all the time says, yeah, hey, this thing in the Bible, not so great, but I have to do it anyway. I mean, my intuition says go have sex with every woman I see. It's called it's called being a dude.
Okay.
Yeah.
You have some interesting intuitions.
I'm sorry.
All good. So sure. So so
yeah, I don't think just because I feel like I want to do a thing that I am obligated to do the thing.
Sure. So if God can just make morality whatever he wants, so you say that absent God, morality would be subjective, correct?
Yeah, or it just seems arbitrary. Where are we even getting it?
Right. So absent God, morality would just be.
That would be my objection to whatever explanation you make for the source of morality. It
But
wouldn't
so
be subjective necessarily, but it's probably going to be my objection.
Well, wait. So would it?
I would say
sorry,
absent God, we wouldn't have any justification for morality that I would see as coherent. And if you were to try to give me one, I would probably call it subjective. That's
Okay.
90% of my objections would be that it's subjective.
Sure. So can God make subjective things objective? So could God make there be an objectively best flavor of ice cream?
An objectively best flavor. Of course, it's called. No, I'm just kidding. I would say probably not. No, I don't think so.
Oh, okay. So wait. So you say that morality. Okay.
Mhm.
So I think this, I can syllogistically disprove your position. So
Okay.
if God cannot make things that would otherwise be subjective objective, and morality would otherwise be subjective, then God could not make it objective.
Okay, I wouldn't say otherwise would be subjective. I'm just saying like that would be my objection to if you try to give an explanation. My objection to God not being the source of morality would be, what is the source of morality? It's arbitrary. It wouldn't necessarily be that it's subjective. Subjective is my objection to this replacement morality. It's usually my objection.
Well, wait, but so when you say it's arbitrary, what do you mean by that?
Sure. Well, like if you came up and you said, here's this new moral law, I would say like that's arbitrary. Where did you get the moral law? Like, did you just write that yourself, so to speak?
Right. But so that seems to be the case with all subjective things. I mean, if I say this is the new best flavor of ice cream, you could say why? And I would say, well, I have a subjective view that it's the best flavor of ice cream. Likewise, I could say I have a subjective view that you shouldn't kill babies.
Sure.
Right. So then it would be subjective.
Morality would be subjective if we didn't have God. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. If morality absent a God is just a statement of preferences that is arbitrary and ad hoc, then it is subjective. God cannot make subjective things objective. God cannot ground morality.
Sure, but the first premise is saying if morality is, and then you're describing morality in a way that it isn't. I don't see how that's.
Wait, which of my descriptions of morality are incorrect?
Well, you said, I mean, you can help me with the language because I didn't memorize it, but you said if morality is just a subjective opinion, is that what you're saying?
Well, if morality is just an arbitrary statement of preferences.
Yeah. But I don't think morality is
absent a God, what would morality be if it's not a statement of preferences?
It wouldn't be. I don't think that it is a subjective statement of preferences. I just think it wouldn't be, and people trying to assert that it does exist would give me their preferences. I don't think that's just an explanation for what it is that commonly arises. I don't think that's what it would be.
Would morality be? Would morality be logically impossible absent a God?
Objective morality, yeah, I would think is logically impossible.
Wait, okay. Can God? But you have said that God cannot make things that are logically impossible.
Well, sure, but God's not making morality absent God. He's just making morality.
Sure. Okay, but so if a thing would be logically impossible absent, like that applies to all things that are logically impossible. So, for example, if I say a square circle is logically impossible absent God, you could say, well, God can make a square circle because it's not absent God.
Wait.
The whole point is that God cannot make things that would be logically impossible absent God.
I don't follow you there. Just because something is logically impossible always doesn't mean. I mean,
well, the nature of a thing,
God,
that's logically impossible is it's not contingent on the things that exist in the universe.
Sure. Yeah. If something's logically impossible, it means that it conceptually contradicts. Yeah.
Right.
So God couldn't make that actually exist if it can't conceptually exist.
You can't have a thing that is contingently logically impossible.
You can't have a thing that's contingently logically impossible, you said?
Yes.
So describe that for me, or elaborate a little bit.
The nature of logic is that logic is a necessary existence. You cannot have a contingent logical impossibility.
You cannot have a contingent a necessary logical impossibility?
No, necessary and contingent are different. You can't have a thing. You cannot have a thing that is logically impossible contingent on something else.
You can't have a thing that's logically impossible.
You can't.
Yeah, because you couldn't have the thing. Yeah. because the
Right.
thing just
And
wouldn't
so
be.
if you say that objective morality is logically impossible,
Mhm.
you cannot say that
Wait,
that is
I didn't say it's logically
contingent
impossible.
on the non-existence of God. You said that it was logically impossible absent God.
Yeah,
You
it's logically
cannot have it
impossible
be
absent God.
contingent on the absence of God because logical claims cannot be contingent
Logical claims cannot be contingent.
on material things
How you get? Wait. God isn't a material thing.
or on like things in general. Like 1 + 1 equaling 2 could not
Cannot
be
be contingent on
contingent.
physical. Yeah.
Well, and couldn't be contingent. Could God make 1 + 1 equal 3? No, because it's logically impossible.
He could switch the values and make 2 and 3
Well,
represent
sure. So
different
you
things.
can
Yeah.
change what the words mean, but
No, not
I
even the
can do-
words, the concepts. Like if I'm programming, I can make false be the variable that represents is, and true mean the variable that represents is not. Like it
Right,
doesn't make
but
a
so
difference.
then you're just changing the signifiers that you attach
Yeah, the
things
concepts. Yeah.
to. Right,
You
but
can make
with
concepts
the
that do
concept
different-
of
behave
1
differently.
meaning what we mean when we say the concept of 1. 1
Sure,
+ 1
sure.
cannot equal 3.
I'm with you there. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. The
And you
concept
say
1 + 1 cannot equal
that
the concept 3.
morality would be impossible absent of God. God can't make it.
Sure. Yeah. I say morality is logically impossible absent God. Yeah.
Right, so then God could not make it.
God couldn't make morality because I'm not
you
following.
cannot a God cannot violate logical impossibility.
Yeah, he can't do anything that's logically impossible. That's correct.
Right. He can't
And when
do
I say that,
anything
that's not a limitation
logically
on him.
impossible absent a God.
He can't do something that's logically impossible absent a God. Why not?
Because the nature of a thing that is logically impossible, it cannot be contingent.
But if it's contingent, then it's not logically impossible.
Yeah, exactly. So if it's
Okay.
logically impossible, it can't be contingent.
So then
You say that
the
it
laws
would
of
be
morality wouldn't
logically
be logically
impossible absent a God. Its logical impossibility cannot be contingent on the non-existence of God. It would have to be logically impossible. God couldn't make it.
Sure. So morality isn't logically impossible. Morality is contingent on the existence of God.
Wait, but you said that morality was logically impossible absent a God.
No, I'm saying it's logically impossible absent a God, but morality isn't logically impossible because there's a God.
Wait, but logical impossibility
Mhm.
cannot be contingent on the non-existence of God.
Logical impossibility cannot be contingent on the absence of God. How do you get there?
Because God cannot violate logical impossibility. Like, okay.
Wait. How do you get from point A? I agree with point B. I don't agree with point A. How do you get to there?
Okay, so
Mhm.
logical impossibility cannot be contingent.
Wait, logical impossibility cannot be contingent. What do you mean by that?
If a thing is logically impossible,
it can't be possible based on something else because it's just impossible all around, is what you're saying.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, so
if something's just always impossible, then it can't be possible under certain conditions because it's always impossible.
Right. So then morality, to the extent morality cannot be logically impossible only under certain conditions.
It can't be logically impossible only under certain conditions?
Because things cannot, you have said categorically, things cannot be only contingently logically impossible.
Wait. Explain that one to me a little more.
Wait, so premise 1 said that things that are logically impossible cannot be contingent on other things.
Yeah, if they're all around logically impossible, then they can't be possible under certain conditions. Yeah, I agree with that.
Right. So then morality, if it's would be logic, morality is logical impossibility, cannot be contingent on the non-existence of God.
Why not? I'm not saying morality is logically impossible. I'm just saying morality is impossible under certain conditions.
But again, you can't have something be logically impossible under certain conditions because logical impossibility can't be contingent.
Sure. +1 = 2 is impossible under the condition that the first premise is 3. But it's
wait, what?
Sure, it's
3. Wait, 3 is not a premise. A premise has to be like a statement of truth.
Sure. Let's say 3 is the true value. Like,
wait, what? Sorry, wait. Give me an example of a statement that is contingently logically impossible.
That is contingently logically possible? Well, yeah, an and statement would be contingently logically. It would be false. An and statement about possibility would be.
Wait, so give an example of a statement.
I don't know. This cup is empty.
I'm sorry, I misspoke there. I meant to say, give me an example of a statement that is contingently logically impossible.
That is contingently logically impossible. Sure. Well, I don't know. You could say, oh boy, you're really throwing me under the bus here. I mean, Socrates is a man. You know, all men are mortal. Socrates is mortal. Essentially, you know, it's you require both premises to be true. So it's contingent on, if you were to say just all men are mortal and Socrates is mortal, that would be the fact that it's true that Socrates must be mortal, or that it's impossible for Socrates not to be mortal, is contingent upon whether or not Socrates
that's
is a
not
man.
logically impossible. That's just an empirical finding.
No, it would be if Socrates was not a man, or I'm sorry, the other way around. If Socrates, or we can do both ways. Yeah, Socrates.
But Socrates' mortality is not a logical impossibility. It's just a contingent claim.
Sure, but the necessity of it would not be logically necessary.
Yes, exactly. It wouldn't be logically necessary.
Sure. So
I asked you to give an example of a claim that is a logical impossibility that is contingent on something else.
A claim. I'm really having a hard time following you. You're saying a claim of something that's logically impossible.
Okay. You cannot have
without something else.
Right. My claim is that you cannot have a logical a logical statement of possibility or impossibility that is contingent on something else, absent it being a description of that thing. And so, for example, you could have some statements like that. So you could say, like, X is logically impossible. If X is if something is a description of me, you can say math, like, if this if deity defeater exists, in exactly the way that we prescribe that he exists, then, well, that wouldn't be never mind, scratch that. That wouldn't even be a logical claim. Like, you cannot have claims of logical necessity that are contingent.
Sure. Well, I think the problem we're getting into is we're saying something is logically necessary. That implies that there are no constraints on it, like it just is or it is not. I think that's sort of the problem we're getting into. So it wouldn't really be logically impossible if there's a possibility. It's just sort of a way of us expressing it. It would be like it's only possible through this one method, and all other methods are not logically possible. I think that's sort of what we're getting at here.
Okay, I don't understand. So your claim is that it is not logically impossible for there to be morality absent a God.
Yeah. I mean, I don't understand how that's a problem, that there can only be one source of a thing.
Well, okay, so then you could have a objective morality absent a God.
Wait. So you can have objective morality absent a God? That's the opposite of what I just agreed to.
Wait, yes or no? Is it logically possible to have objective morality absent a God?
Oh, no, I don't know.
So, again,
no,
you cannot have logical impossibility be contingent on something.
Well, sure, but at that point, it wouldn't be a logical impossibility. It would just be the only logical possibility. So it'd be impossible except for this.
So, okay, so then absent a God. Wait, so your claim is that objective morality is impossible absent a God, but so this description of what objective morality is it is a statement of God's decrees, and a statement of God's decrees can only exist if there is a God.
I wouldn't say a statement of God's decrees necessarily, but yes, sure, something that is derived from God.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So then why should I care about what God says? Like, if it's just arbitrary preferences of God, why is that binding? Why should anyone give it any moral weight if it's just whatever God says?
I mean, subjectively, you can assign your own value to whatever you want, but
okay, how can, if a thing is just a statement of the preferences of a random dude, then it's not objective, because for it to be objective, it has to be mind
Of course.
independent.
But what if the random dude was the thing making the thing?
What?
What if the random dude was the guy making the thing? Like if I wrote a program and I want this program to print hello world every 1 second, like that's objectively the goal. It's not just an opinion of a random dude. It's the dude that the program was made by.
Yeah, but that would not prove if you generated sentient beings inside the program, they would not be morally obligated to follow whatever moral rules you thought were moral. Even if you
That's a logical impossibility to generate sentient human beings in the case that they're like human-like sentient human minds in a program. For a human to do that that's a logical impossibility, because you're not creating that because I'm not creating humanity. I would be importing humanity.
You're not importing humanity. You're creating a AI.
So am I inventing the concept of humanity when I make this?
No,
this
you're
thing?
not. You're not creating humanity. I'm
just sort of manifesting the concept that already exists.
No, you're not making humans. You're making AI that are similar to humans, that are capable of feeling pleasure and pain. The same way that they would not be bound by your arbitrary decrees. Even if God made the universe, we're not bound by his decrees. Because for it to be objective, it has to be mind independent. If it's dependent on the mind of God, then it's not mind independent.
The problem that you're getting into is once you start talking about creating a human, we could make the objection much simpler, and I could say, imagine I just had a kid, right? Like, do I have total reign over this kid to the point where I can make him, I can set any sort of moral constraints on this kid? The answer is no, because I didn't invent the kid. I only physically am responsible for the production of this kid to an extent. I'm importing human being from something beyond me. I didn't create human being.
So if hypothetically,
what I'm getting at is when you make a computer program, generally you're making the thing that we're talking about. I'm fully responsible for all of its behaviors. But if you're talking about taking something external and putting it in this computer program, at that point, I'm not making the concept.
You're not taking anything external. You're not adding any external human brains. You're creating these AGIs.
I'm a human being, and I'm creating humanity.
No, you're not creating humanity. You're creating things that are kind of similar to humans.
Okay, kind of similar, but not humanity.
They're not humanity, but they can feel pleasure. They can feel pain. Their suffering is as real as yours or mine.
Wait. How did you get to their suffering is as real as yours or mine? My suffering is human suffering. Do they have human suffering?
Well, no, they don't have human suffering. But
okay, they have like human suffering, so it's not as real as mine. It's similar to mine.
It is as real as yours. It's just not identical to yours. Like you have Elijah suffering. I have whatever my name is suffering.
Yeah. Should I not say your name?
Well, you can say Deity Defeater.
All right, okay. Got it. It's Jim.
So you can have so you have Elijah suffering. I have Jim suffering.
Okay.
My name's not actually Jim.
I know.
So then, just because our sufferings are different does not mean that there is a distinction between ours such that yours is more important than mine or mine is more important than yours. Likewise, just because one is human suffering and the other one is AI suffering does not mean that they are not equally real.
Sure. The fact that we're calling them different things doesn't make them different levels, but I would say their innate value is what makes them actually like a problem. Like human suffering is a problem because it's human suffering. It's not that it's just some electrons firing a certain way. Oh, actually, my phone's at 1%. You want to give me like 10 seconds?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Hey, all of you 0 people who are watching right now. Hopefully, some people will watch like the replay of it. It's been a good discussion so far. All right.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, and we're live once again. Okay. So if I made a computer program or if you made a computer program, you seem to be the more tech savvy between the two of us. So if you made a computer program, and you created sentient beings that were not humans, but that suffered sort of the same way that humans do, their suffering was as acute as ours. regardless of what rules you put into the computer program,
Mhm.
those AI would not be morally bound by those rules, because for morality to be an objective phenomenon, it has to be mind independent. To the extent that it's contingent on the thing written down by the programmer, then it's not mind independent and it's not objective.
Sure. So it has to be mind independent in order to have morality. Is that what you're sort of getting at?
Yeah, so like a chair exists even if
Mhm.
or the like Jupiter exists even if people don't realize that it exists because it's
Okay. So
objective. It
Jupiter's
exists.
mind independent. It's just
Yeah, it
objective.
exists independent of the mind. For morality to be objective, it has to exist independent of the mind. If it's contingent on the will of the creator, then it doesn't exist independent of the mind.
Wait. I don't see the relationship between Jupiter existing be independent of my mind and morality existing independent of the creator's mind. Like if I created Jupiter, I would know that I created Jupiter, and then it wouldn't be independent of
Right,
my mind.
but if you created Jupiter, even if you didn't realize that you had created Jupiter, if you
Mhm.
just made a universe, didn't check on it,
Okay.
you just made a random one just to mess
Mhm.
around, and
Sure.
you made Jupiter. Jupiter would exist regardless of of what you thought about it.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Right. And morality, if it's contingent on your mind, then it's not an objective thing. It's just whatever you arbitrarily decided it is.
Well, sure. It would be objective so far as the creator is objective. So like it would be from the position of the thing being acted upon, it would be objective because it's not a sub it's not like the subscripted attribute of the object being created. It would be an objective sort of attribute being put on by the author itself.
Okay, so your view of morality, it's just God said these things, thus you should follow them.
Not necessarily said them, but it's sort of
Or God decreed them.
sure. Yeah. He
Okay, why
created
should I
these
follow
attributes
them?
somehow. Yeah. I mean, you don't have to follow them.
Why should
I
I
would
follow
recommend
them?
it.
Why should I objectively follow them?
Why objectively are you obligated to follow them?
Yeah.
It would be the same reason that like a computer program would be objectively obligated to do what I tell it to do, like
Wait,
because it's mine, because I own it.
Why would a computer program be objectively obligated to do what you tell it to do?
Because it's mine.
Why does that mean it's obligated to do what you tell them to do?
Because I don't understand the question because I own the thing because it's my thing. Like if I create a process, the process ought follow my thing. Like that's what
Why?
I've decided.
Like
Because I'm
you're not giving a justification. You're just sort of asserting it a bunch of times.
well sure because if I create the thing and I create the attributes of the thing, one of the attributes that I can create is obligation. So I can obligate this thing to follow me.
How can you create
And
an
I do.
obligation?
Because it would be an attribute of the object. So if I created a program and one of the attributes, so to speak, is a comment that says this program prints hello world every second, then that's the computer's obligation because that's what I've decided. That's what I
That
set the
doesn't seem to
obligation
get you
variable to
over
be.
the is ought divide. If that's just a thing, an attribute that you program, like what would it even mean to program an ought? Like to program an ought into a computer?
It would just be whatever that attribute represents. Like it's just something that I put on the computer. It's just another thing.
Okay, but why ought they follow it? If it's just a thing that you write into the code,
Mhm.
like why should they care?
It sounds like the problem you're getting at is we're importing this human obligation which exists much more in a much more complicated sense than just a computer program do this because I said do this, and then we're prescribing it onto something much more simple. That's sort of the problem we're running into. Is that obligation? You're taking your actual experience of obligation and you're projecting it onto this object. I don't think the object follows our experience of obligation. I think it would follow whatever obligation is put on it by its creator.
But again, what like that doesn't answer why it should follow that the obligations put on it by its creator.
Sure, because the creator creates obligation, and like that's part of the definition of being a creator.
How do you create a mortal obligation? The
I mean,
things that
I can't create a moral obligation objectively speaking, but I can create it
Well,
a moral obligation.
How can God cross that is ought divide? God can say, I think X ought to be done, but how
Mhm.
can God make it so that X objectively ought to be done?
Sure, he can put the attributes in the thing that he creates. He can say
How
he
can
can
you
create
make
something
an
with the
ought? How
obligation.
can you get across the is ought divide?
It's well the obligation lives in the object. It's an attribute of the object. I'm obligated to do things and you're obligated to do things. So if God creates us with an obligation, then we're obligated to do those things. That's just sort of by
Okay.
definition
Wait,
of being obligated. If you
so
have an obligation, you're
obligation is
obligated to do the thing.
contingent. So all of morality is contingent on the specific object.
Well, I mean, it's universally applied, but sure.
Well, so is it?
You can have subjective obligations. You can have smaller object-specific obligations, but we're inheriting them all.
So is it bad if like malaria infects me?
Is it bad? In what way? Is it bad from your
Like,
point of view?
Is it just
objective?
Is it objectively bad if malaria infects me?
It depends what you mean by objectively bad. Are you talking about like
I'm
an
asking
act of evil?
I'm asking under what you mean by objectively bad.
Well, there are multiple senses of things that are objectively bad. Like if my house burnt down, I'm suffering, and that's objectively worse from my point of view. But
but it's not object. Well, I mean, I think it would be objectively bad. But would me getting malaria be objectively bad?
It wouldn't be objectively bad in the same sense of somebody giving you malaria, like somebody walking up and injecting it to you because there's no act of evil being done on you. But it would. There are definitions in which we call
human
bad.
acts of evil. That's the only thing that can be good or bad.
No. I'm just saying there are different ways in which we use the word bad in which we apply it to scenarios. So just not to equivocate, I'm saying it would be bad in the same way that my house burning down would be bad. It's not an act of evil on the part of malaria.
Yeah, but I'm not asking about an act of evil on the part of the agent. I'm asking, would it be in an objective sense, if I get malaria, better for me to have not gotten malaria?
Yeah. In the sense that it would be better for my house not to burn down. In that sense, yes.
Well, but would that be an objective thing or a subjective thing under your view?
You could say it's an objective thing, sure.
Okay.
I mean, it wouldn't be the same sort of bad as actually aggressing, but it would be
So
then a different definition.
So then does God make malaria with moral obligations?
I don't think God makes malaria with moral obligations because
God makes us with moral obligations.
Yeah, but malaria is not a moral agent. It would be us, yeah.
Okay.
Or it's really the universe, and then we kind of inherit it as moral agents.
Okay, wait. So can a thing? Okay. Oh, sure. So then that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay, I think I don't think you have a sufficient explanation of why God is able to ground statements of what ought to be done. But we've been going over my arguments against God for an hour. Mm. So if you want to give arguments for God, shoot.
Sure. Okay. So I would give 3. I would say
let's go one by one.
One by one. Okay, yeah. So I would say first of all, objective value hierarchies. This idea that true and false are actually objectively meaningful, and they're not just these sort of values that exist in a vacuum that we just pick and choose in our equations, so to speak. We actually have to presuppose when we're invoking the laws of logic that certain values are just objectively better than other values, and that we ought to go for these values rather than other values. I think that is, I think it's logically necessary because that's what we argue.
It sounded a lot like Jordan Peterson. So that which grounds the objective value hierarchies, that's what we ultimately refer to as God. And the atheists, they can say that they don't believe in it. That's yeah, man, you believe it to your core.
It's yeah, man, but the atheists don't believe in lobsters either, so you might as well just give up at that point.
Your impression's quite good. Okay,
yours is pretty good. I like yours. I don't bloody think I can choose 2 sides.
Yeah, yours is really good. Okay, so...
thank you.
Sure, so... Are these objective value hierarchies a byproduct of logic?
No, they're not a byproduct of logic. They would be a supposition of logic. They're one of the
Okay.
things we suppose.
Okay, so what value? So when you say a value hierarchy,
Mhm.
you're basically saying like why like it is better to not stab out baby's eyes than to
No,
stab out.
I would say more from a like a philosophically or an intellectually like good goal. Like it's good reasoning to reason to the true value rather than the false value, and that this isn't just my opinion. It's actually objective. Like this is the best. This is the good goal, essentially.
So when you say it's a good goal, do you mean in an like in a normative sense, like X
No,
goal
like an
is?
intellectual / philosophical kind of way.
Wait, but what? How? I mean, how good things are inherently normative claims. Like when you say X is good, you either mean
Mhm.
X is instrumentally good for some other purpose, or you mean in a normative sense, X is good.
Normative meaning like general.
Normative meaning like in a moral sense. Like,
Oh, moral? No, I'm not making a moral
okay,
claim.
so what do you mean when you say it is better to hold these to like believe in truth and logic?
Sure. Well, when we argue, we are essentially defending our positions as true, and we're trying to prove the other position is false. But what
Right,
I'm getting at is that, like,
but the fact that
what significance is true or false, right? Like, suppose that they're insignificant, then so are the arguments that reach those conclusions.
so I have goals. I think that those goals. I
Mhm.
also have a view of metaethics, but so I have goals. I want to achieve those goals. I think a good way of achieving those goals is by abiding by ideas of truth and falsehood.
Okay.
So,
But is this
sure.
just purely your opinion?
No, truth and falsehood exist as objective phenomenon based on so if we define
No, I
X,
understand that. I mean, like, that you want to, not that you want to achieve the goals, but that those are the goals. Is it just your goal, or is this everyone's goal?
well, I
Is
think
this
most
ultimately a good
people, I
goal?
think most people's goals generally correspond with truth is generally instrumentally valuable in achieving most people's goals.
Okay.
Um,
And if most people decided that false was just good for achieving the goals, would that make false the new sort of objectively good reasoning? Like
well,
those
no,
people
but
that reason to false would now
neither
be the better
neither
arguers?
truth nor falsity are themselves objectively good or bad. They
Is
are
that
only,
true?
yeah, I think so.
And
Well,
so
that
what?
just proves that truth and falsehood exist. That does not prove that
Well, but the fact that
those
you're
are.
arguing to it means it implies that you're making some sort of objective statement about the universe, and that I
No,
should
it
care, should I
implies
not?
that whatever my goals are,
Mhm.
I think that knowing true things is desirable instrumentally for pursuing those goals. That does not mean that truth is itself some intrinsic good.
Okay.
So
So
I don't think
if your
truth.
goals were to achieve false, then that would be okay to you. Like that would be a
Well,
good.
if my goal was to achieve falsity,
Mhm.
then I would try
That
to
would be a good
like
goal for you.
maximize falsehood in the world.
Okay. Okay.
I
So
mean,
the pursuit
truth
of
is only
truth for
instrumentally
you.
valuable for my goals.
So you would say okay. So you would say the pursuit of truth for you is more of a. It's just sort of this pragmatic. Like this happens to be what serves my purposes.
Yeah,
It's not
truth.
necessarily that truth has some sort of objective value over false.
Well, it depends on what you mean by objective value. I think that to the extent that that morality is objective, which I think it is, and we can get
Mhm.
into that, and truth better upholds in my view, correct moral goals.
Mhm.
Then the pursuit of truth produces something that is objectively moral, but truth itself is an instrumental. It is instrumentally valuable for objective good, but it is not itself an objective good.
Okay. So truth is only good so long as it achieves your goals, but you justify your moral goal objectively.
Yeah, I think I could grant it objectively.
Okay. Then it sounds like we probably need to go more into the moral arguments than the
Well, but even if I couldn't grant it objectively, that wouldn't
Mhm.
matter. I could say I just
Really?
happen to really like well-being.
Okay.
Because my goal is to maximize well-being, I think truth is good for like getting a bunch of well-being in the long run. I want to get a bunch of well-being in the long run, therefore I try to like get truth.
Okay. And you would have no argument with somebody who came along and said, I think false is a good way of achieving my goals, and my goal is suffering. At least in this supposition, suppose you don't have an objective backing
Yeah,
for your moral
absent an
framework.
objective morality, I could not prove that you should value well-being more than suffering.
Sure,
But
and then you also wouldn't have any
most-
sort of intellectual argument with a person who says, "And I'm going to use false to get there."
sure, but most people, I think, value well-being more than suffering. Like, I
Okay.
think that when you put your hand on a hot stove, people will pull away because they prefer well-being to suffering.
Sure, but is that objectively, is that an objective value in this case?
I think it is, but even if it weren't,
Okay.
you could still attempt to ground it.
We-
Or you
well,
could,
sure, but
you could still
at the
say
end of the
that
day, you'd be
truth is a
grasping
valuable
at straws.
instrument. No, you wouldn't.
Yeah.
You would say, my goal is to achieve X. I like that goal. I want to achieve it. Truth is
Okay.
good for it. Thus, I do truth.
But what
Right,
if your goal is
achieve-
Y and false is good for achieving Y? Then false.
Well,
would be the
then I
goal.
would try to maximize falsehood, or try
Okay.
to achieve falsehood.
You
to
would
whatever-
try to maximize falsehood if it fit your goals, is what you're essentially saying.
Yeah.
Okay. So why are we having this debate?
Well, because my goals happen to correspond with truth generally.
Okay. All right.
I prefer
And-
truth to falsehood.
Got it. So, like, give me an example of one of these goals, or actually, I mean, you don't even have to. Let's just say,
Well, maximizing
this-
well-being. I think that.
yeah, okay.
like,
Let's say the
that's my-
scenario changed, and then false was able to maximize this thing. Would you now be advocating for things that you believed that were false?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. All right. Why?
Because I value well-being.
Okay, but isn't one of our presuppositions when we're having this debate that ultimately truth is this objective goal that we ought to strive for? It's not just sort of like, hey, let's debate for the number 4, right? Like, why aren't we debating for the number 4 right now? You know,
The reason we're debating right now, partially because I think that the pursuit of truth is good for
Mhm.
achieving my well-being, partially because I think that discussions are just enjoyable for the pursuit of well-being, partially because I want to expand my YouTube channel. Like, and with people who are watching, you should
Mhm.
like and subscribe, of course.
You will. You're pretty good at it.
Yeah. So I have a goal. I think that this discussion brings me a lot of things that bring me closer to my goals. Thus, I am having this discussion.
Okay. Sure.
Great. So,
So-
like, I don't see how your argument holds any water.
Sure. So what I'm getting at is that when we're invoking laws of logic, part of the game sort of laws of logic are the end goal, right? Like if you're playing Sudoku, you've got the rules, and one of the rules is that your goal is to have all the numbers filled out, right? Your goal is not to make a smiley face or something. And so when we're having these logical discussions, or I mean, really any laws of logic presuppose any logical discussion that invokes the laws of logic. It's presupposing this idea that truth is the goal that we want. So when I say that the existence of God is logically necessary, what I'm saying is that this thing that we presuppose in order to invoke the laws of logic cannot exist independent God. So I mean, like, you could say, you know, false things I would like false things more if they benefited me more, but I don't think it would at all hurt the argument that the existence of God is logically necessary. It would just sort of devolve into this postmodernist, like, I don't mind if things are false. Like, I don't mind living in a worldview that's false.
Just a postmodernism. Like, that's some
The
rough
bloody
stuff.
postmodernists.
Yeah. Sure. So the reason why I don't think that what you're saying is correct is because what you're saying is that if I play Sudoku,
Mhm.
presumably I go, or not place. If I fill out a Sudoku, presumably I go into it with the goal of completing the Sudoku, making the numbers line out. But
Sure.
that does not prove that it's my ultimate goal in life. For example,
No.
if I could violate the rules of Sudoku, but it would like
Mhm.
save a child from dying, I would absolutely do that because it's not my ultimate value. We
Sure.
don't have to presuppose that it's decreed by the universe, that it exists in some objective sense. To say, I have a goal, this is good for achieving my goals, thus I do it.
Sure. But I'm saying from the perspective of Sudoku, at least, saving that child, at least in your hypothetical, wouldn't be the goal.
From the but from the perspective of what I as an agent do, it is my goal. Likewise,
Okay,
the
of course.
like adhering to truth is a thing that I generally pursue instrumentally because it has instrumental value, but it's not an intrinsic value. And in the face, if I could lie to save 100 school children, I would absolutely do it.
Okay, but you still wouldn't have any problem with the argument that the existence of God is logically necessary. Then
Why
it
is
would
it
just sort of
logically
be
necessary?
Well, sure. Let's take objective value hierarchies, for example. That, like, if we are to assume that laws of logic are these is the goal, then we're to believe that God exists. But you're essentially just saying, like, but who says laws of logic are good? Like, who says truth is the goal?
Right. Like you do, because you set goals and then you value truth to achieve them. I think that I can ground those goals objectively, but even if you couldn't, you could still say, I just have goals that I happen to enjoy adhering to. I try to adhere to those goals.
But we could agree that if the goal, hypothetically, were to follow the laws of logic, then we would conclude that God would exist. Hypothetically, not that that's the ultimate goal.
Wait, what? No. We can say, like, you could have, it's possible. Like, you could imagine someone who their goal is just to adhere to the laws of logic. That does not prove a god. Even if you prove that the objectively moral thing to do is to adhere to the laws of logic, that still would not prove a god. Why would it?
Sure, well, because laws of logic would presuppose objective value hierarchies. They presuppose this idea that truth is the ultimate goal.
Okay, so your argument is that if there are objective value hierarchies, then, and we say that objective value hierarchies, if there are objective value hierarchies such that truth and logic are at the top, and those objective value hierarchies cannot exist without a god, then God exists. That argument logically follows. I don't see why either of the premises are true. I don't see why there are objective value hierarchies that put truth and logic at the pinnacle of them, and I don't see why, if there are, God exists.
Sure. Well, the very fact that we're invoking laws of logic to describe the universe around us is evidence that, like, we're arguing towards something that's true right now, right? Like, I could ask you, is your position true, and then I could ask you, like, so what?
Pursuing a goal does not prove that goal is objective.
Sure, of course not, but it assumes that it's relevant to whatever game we're playing, and if what we're playing is logic, like, it assumes that truth is relevant objectively to logic.
No, it assumes that whatever our goals are, truth is. We hold the belief that truth is relevant objectively to our goals, but because so if you have goals that are entirely arbitrary, like, let's suppose that my goal is to just maximize the number of paper clips in the universe, and in order to achieve that goal, it was useful for me to use reason and logic to convince other people that I have their best intentions at heart. For the viewers, I do have your best intentions at heart.
He doesn't. He just wants paper clips.
Yeah.
Don't listen to him.
No.
I'm kidding.
I care about all of you.
Of course.
So even if
you would sell them out for falsehood if it meant achieving your goals.
I would sell them out for paper clips. So if my goal is to maximize paper clips and I value truth and logic, that would not prove that truth and logic are objectively valuable. It would not prove that maximizing paper clips were objectively valuable. And my pursuit of truth and logic certainly would not prove that there's a god.
Okay. Is that true?
Yes.
And who cares?
Well, I care because it's good for achieving my goal of maximizing paper clips. Okay. Or in reality, my goal of maximizing well-being.
Okay. And, like, does that fact matter outside of the people who care about it, so to speak? Is there any sort of objective value in pursuing truth rather than anything else?
I think that there is objective morality, which I would be happy to go into if you want to go into how I ground objective morality.
Sure, I'd like to, but quick, it sounds like you wouldn't have a problem with, like, Pascal's wager, for example, which happens to be, like, I think it's pretty much the dumbest theist argument.
But I think that Pascal's wager is a pretty good argument. But
you think it's a good argument? My objection has always been, like, just because it's, like, pragmatically useful to believe something doesn't mean you ought to believe it.
Yeah, I think there are a bunch of problems with it. One is that you don't choose what you believe. Two, there could be the opposite God who only punishes the Christians. Three, like...
I mean, you can inductively, like, assume that one is more likely than the other.
I mean, I don't know about that one. I don't think that they're, like... I don't think that
if part of God is authoring morality, then you could... It seems to me like it would logically follow that the God that would exist would be the moral God. It wouldn't be the immoral God.
Sure, but I mean, you could just say that the moral thing to do is to only torture the theists. Like, I don't think
Sure,
that
that implies that you don't know morality at all, and that you don't even believe that you know morality. Like it's going off of your own beliefs and saying, I
well,
believe
right,
this, therefore I should believe that.
yeah, but that's sort of what Pascal's wager is. That Pascal's wager is like, you think X, but what if you're wrong? If you're wrong, maybe
Yeah.
it'll have catastrophic consequences, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But if you're wrong, maybe and you go one way, maybe it'll have catastrophic consequences in exactly the opposite way.
So if I could prove that it would just be more useful to you to believe in God, then you would believe in God, regardless of whether or
Well, I
not
didn't
it's true.
choose what I believe.
I mean, you have influence over what you believe.
I mean, you have some, but I could not believe that there were. I could not believe that 1 + 1 = 3, no matter how hard I tried.
But no one can believe that, because that's not a coherent belief. What you would believe would be a misrepresentation.
Would not be able to believe in a God.
Sure, but that sounds like two different things. One is something that cannot be true, and the other is something that you believe is not true.
Well,
like the existence of unicorns, I don't believe is true, but unicorns exist conceptually. Unicorns could exist. There's no logical problem.
I don't think God could exist.
There's logical 1 + 1
exists right now without.
Okay, sure. But I mean, assume it's coherent. Then you could believe.
Sure, but again,
coherent.
Yeah, I mean, do you really want to go into Pascal's wager? Like,
I mean, it's if what you're getting into is that like beliefs are just, or at least true and false is just sort of this pragmatic manifestation of like what suits my desires, then if I could prove to you that it would be more useful to believe in God, would you just convert right here?
I mean, I don't have the choice of what I believe.
You don't have the choice of what you believe? Really?
No.
You have no free will at all.
You have free will. You don't choose what you believe. I mean, wait, but what you said is that God is analogous to unicorns, that it's possible that they exist.
Yeah.
But that, you don't think that they exist. I could not start believing in unicorns, no matter, even if you convinced me that my life would be better if I believed in unicorns, I would still not believe in unicorns.
Really? Why is that? Is true more valuable than just
like? Do you think that I would be able to convince you to believe that if I said, "Yo, your life would be so much better if you believed in unicorns," would you be able to start believing in unicorns?
I mean, I would have a hard time doing it. I'd find my way to, assuming that this were the ultimate moral good, then you could find a way to make yourself believe it.
I don't think that you choose what you believe. But do you want to go into how I?
At the very least, you could say, other people choose what they believe. You could say, like, why would you look for the truth? Right? Like, you can choose what not to believe. You absolutely can. Like, I know for a fact that X is false because I've looked at it and I've seen that it's false. Right? Like, why would you falsify the existence of God if it could make your life better? Why wouldn't you just like kind of be like, oh, yep, it exists, woo, and just sort of convince yourself that it exists?
Even if I said it exists, woo, I could not convince myself that it exists.
Well, yeah, it's not that simple, sure. But let's say you wouldn't even attempt to falsify it.
But if you could convince me that my life would be significantly better if I believed in God, and I had the ability to alter my brain chemistry to believe in God, I would.
Okay, all right. Let's take something that you don't necessarily believe in one way or the other. You're just super ignorant about. Like, can you give me something like that? Do you know anything about loquats?
I know they taste pretty nice.
They're pretty good. What if I said loquats had 4 grams of protein in them?
I would not be able to, absent. Like,
would you like? And I convinced you thoroughly. If you believed this, your life would be better. Would you at all anyway look up like how much protein is in a loquat, or would you just?
Yeah, I would. If that were true, I would go about finding out if your claim were true or not. But I would not be able to convince myself what I believe.
But why would you attempt to find out whether or not my claim is true or false? Is there some sort of objective value to whether or not it's true or false? I thought it was about what makes me feel good and what I like.
Well, because me knowing the truth about loquats would make me happy. I think truth is generally a good heuristic for achieving my goals.
Right, but I'm saying suppose you believing this would make you happy. Like, suppose you just really like the fact that loquats are high protein, like even though 4 grams is not high protein. Let's say this is just what you want. You want to go around making smoothies every day with loquats because they're delicious, and you want to believe that they're really healthy for you, when in fact they may not be.
You believe, like,
sure, but you can choose what you falsify. You can choose what you attempt to what you attempt to investigate.
Sure.
Would you investigate loquats?
Sure. And if you convince me that my life would be better if I believed in God, I would, as I already do now, investigate whether or not I think that it's rational to believe in a God.
But that sounds like the opposite of what we're saying, because if you want to believe in something, why would you attempt to falsify that thing? Right? Like if you need to believe in this thing pragmatically, why would you go looking for where it's not?
Because in my heart, I would be unable to truly believe it absent discovering evidence for it.
Really?
And if I would potentially get value, yeah. I mean, if you have no evidence for a claim, would you be able to convince yourself that that claim is true?
I mean, I wouldn't be convinced one way or another. I just wouldn't know.
Right.
Like, I don't know if the Loch Ness Monster ever really existed, or if it was a hoax this whole time.
Right.
I mean, I lean against. I think it probably didn't.
Right. Yeah. So you would not be able to choose what you believe based on that.
Sure, but if it made my life better to believe that it were true, then I would go about saying to myself, "Hey, this were true," and then I would. I mean, at least under your supposed worldview.
I don't think that it's possible to convince yourself of what is true based on just like thinking really hard about how much you wish you believed it were true.
Okay. But okay, but suppose it were, like, then would that be the good thing to do?
Yeah, if it were, if you could convince me that believing in God would make my life better, I could just go poof, believe in God.
Okay.
Or poof, not poof, but I would do it.
Got it. Okay. So like if the Muslims took over and they said convert or die, you'd become a Muslim, and you would at least try to believe in Islam as best you could.
Well, I would pretend to believe in Islam. I would not.
Not even pretend. Why would you even attempt to hold on to your atheism in any way? Like, is there some value to truth?
I mean, I think
would you secretly keep it in the back of your mind and go, I'm never letting this go. I'm gonna pass it down through generations, or even not that, but why would you even focus on it? Like, if it's just a value that's true.
I probably wouldn't think about it that much. If I could never share my ideas about religion without being killed, I would try to think about religion as little as possible because it would make me upset.
Wait, you'd think about religion as little as possible, but living would make you happy. Wouldn't you want to focus on religion? Wouldn't you want to become like the most religious person ever so that you could get all this virtue?
Sure, but I don't think that I could convince myself that God exists.
Okay, but if you could, you would do it.
If I could, and it benefited me pragmatically, I would.
Okay, that's fair.
Okay, so do you want to go into a discussion of my fantastic meta ethics?
Yeah, sure, we can do that. I do have to cut it close here. Let me see. I told the guy I would meet him for some pawn seat. You know how I feel about pawn seat. It's my political worldview.
Okay.
Give me 10 seconds here. All right, we're good.
All right. Wait,
where did you go?
You're frozen on my
end.
Frozen?
Yeah. Let me get back to there we go. My browser. What? Where did you go? Are you still there?
Wait, what? Yeah, I'm still here.
I don't know how technology works. I claim to be a software engineer. I have no understanding of technology. For the love of heck, bro. I swear to heck. I click on the thing, doesn't even open it. There's just no tabs open. Okay, well, this is nice.
For the people who are watching the stream, can you all still hear me?
Very, very sorry. I can still hear you.
You can? Okay.
Yeah, I can. I don't know, bro. There's like a new tab on my screen. I'm just going to close my browser and reopen. I might disconnect. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Wait, I'm going to remove you from the stream and then reopen the link, and then you can rejoin.
Fine.
All right. Well, it seems to be gone, that we should be back in a second. I hope you all are enjoying the stream. It's been a good discussion so far. It will be interesting to get into the basis of metaethics. I find metaethics generally to be a pretty interesting discussion. I think that his claim about the logical impossibility of God absent, or of objective morality absent God, does not make sense, because you cannot have logical impossibility be contingent on something else. So you cannot say 1 + 1 = 2 if and only if we're in this certain universe. Logic transcends universes. And Elijah is back. I'm going to add him. All right. You're back. You can.
Yes, I have returned
All right. Cool.
from the metaphysical substrate. Okay, cool.
So we returned from the metaphysical substrate. It's
You're gonna
like,
rescue your father from the something.
and it's like, that's not easy stuff, man. Takes you to a dark place. Okay.
Exactly.
So my moral view, as you may have deduced by me saying it a bunch of times, is I'm a utilitarian.
Okay.
I think that well-being is, so the way I lay it out, premise 1, well-being is all that is good. Premise 2, one ought to maximize that which is good. Premise 3, or conclusion, therefore one ought to maximize well-being.
Okay. How do we get premise 1?
So we get premise 1 from the fact, so there are a couple of ways we can derive it. One is that self-interested agents desire well-being, which proves that it's good. To the extent that self-interested agents only desire that which is good for them, how
do you ground that? Like, they are only interested in things that are good, therefore, and then they're interested in it, therefore it's good. How do you get into the
self-interested agents care about what's good for them? Being interested.
How do you know?
Agents, well, that's just the definition of being self-interested.
Okay, so good for them, but not necessarily objectively
good. Sure. Well, if it is true that as an objective phenomenon, self-interested agents would desire their own well-being, but a self-interested agent could not desire a perfectly rational self-interested agent with ultimate knowledge could not desire their own horrific suffering, then that proves that well-being is objectively good.
Why would it be objectively good? Because it's an objective phenomenon? What do you mean?
Well, no, because if self-interested agents only desire that which is good for them, and
good for them, yeah,
impossible for a self-interested agent to rationally desire suffering, then that proves that suffering would not be good for them, and that well-being would be good for them.
Yeah, good for them. Yeah, subjectively, right?
Well, that proves that well-being is good for them.
Good for them, yeah.
Well, so they care about things that are good for them. They care about well-being for them. Therefore, well-being is good. Because if you just replace well-being with which is good, then you get like that well-being is good.
But it sounds like it's still just good for them. How do we get to objectively good?
Well, no. So the for them's cancel out. So the premise 1, self-interested agents desire that which is good for them. Premise 2, self-interested agents desire well-being for themselves. Or I guess in premise 1, it should have been self-interested agents desire that which is good for themselves. Premise 2, self-interested agents desire well-being for themselves. Therefore, well-being is good, because the themselves cancel out.
Okay. But at that point, then, like, if we're canceling it out and we're saying that it's objective goodness, it would have to be objective goodness through and through. It would have to be objectively good for self-interested agents to pursue objective good for themselves, right?
No, so the for themselves cancel out, right? So they care about things that are good for themselves. They care about things that produce well-being for themselves. That proves that well-being is good.
Okay.
And because the themselves and the premises cancel out.
But your definition of good is a subjective one at the beginning.
Oh no, the definition.
So would it be a subjective one at the end? Like you're saying it's subjectively good.
No, it's objectively good, I think.
Wait, so at the beginning, self-interested beings desire things that are objectively good for themselves.
There is a perfectly rational self-interested agent only has a reason to objectively desire that which is objectively good for themselves.
How do you figure that?
What reason is there to desire anything that's not good?
Well, wouldn't there be an infinite number of reasons to do anything? Like there are just infinite subjective reasons for anything. Like I may or may not want to do literally anything. So there could be an infinite number of reasons for
if
each
they
individual
care
thing.
about what is good for themselves, then the only thing that it is rational for them to pursue are things that are, as a matter of fact, good for themselves.
Well, wait. How do you get from care to rationality? How do you get from they care about this, therefore it's rational to pursue this?
Well, a self-interested agent rationally desires their well-being.
Okay. So a self-interested agent is defined as one who it's rational for them to pursue their well-being.
No, a self-interested agent is defined as someone who values things that are good for themselves.
Okay. So that's definitionally what a self-interested being is, and so then
Right.
it would be irrational for a self-interested being to not desire that, because just purely by the definition of self-interested being.
So self-interested agents care about things that are good for themselves.
Mhm.
They care about things that produce well-being for themselves. Proves that a self-interested agent rationally recognizes that well-being has the property of being good, and to the extent that it has the property of being good, we should attempt to maximize it.
Sure. Well, then, when you say they pursue things that are good for themselves, you're saying good in their own view. Is that correct? I don't want to misrepresent you.
Sure, but in this case,
Is it exclusively their view, or is it objectively good?
well, I'm saying that I think that it is objectively good for themselves to the extent that it would be impossible for them to rationally desire anything other than their well-being.
But that wouldn't be objectively good. That would just be objectively like coherent definition.
No, to the extent that well-being is that it is objectively rational for them to desire well-being,
Mhm.
to the extent that they are self-interested,
Yeah.
and a self-interested agent desires that which is good for themselves, and it's good for them to desire well-being for themselves. The self-interest and like between the it's like if a self-interested agent, if it is rational for a self-interested agent to desire X for themselves, and it is rational for a self-interested agent to desire Y for themselves, then Y would have the property of being X. So like if it is rational for a self-interested agent to desire things that are good for themselves, and it's rational for them only things that are good for themselves, and it's rational for them only to desire well-being, then those two would have to be the same thing. The only thing that is objectively good would be well-being.
Okay. So, and when you say it's rational for them to pursue this, are you talking about like a third-party description of like events or concepts being rational, or are you talking about like an obligation that sort of emanates from them, and that's a rational obligation?
I think that. Well, I think.
Like, are we observing this, or are we experiencing like third person, or is this a first person description? Because I feel like those are different words. To say it's rational to do something can have two meanings, right? Like it's rational for water to fall when I pour it because gravity. But
that's
not the same as like it's rational for me to go down, the water to go down. Like the water isn't reasoning to, hey, I need to do that. It just is. It's like a consequence of reality.
Well, so in this case, it's just it is a description.
Mhm.
Like it is just sort of a truth that emanates from the unit that just exists the same way that other truths exist. That it is that it is rational for them to desire their well-being and desire the avoidance of their suffering. I mean, like, do you think
That's
it
like a
would be
descriptor
possible for there to be a rational, self-interested being who wants to just torture themselves as much as possible and be miserable for all of eternity? Could one selfishly desire that?
I wouldn't say rational from their perspective. It would be like irrational from our perspective, because by definition, if something desires its own good, then it wouldn't.
They are rational.
Are you saying they're behaving irrationally, or are you saying that the concept is irrational?
So if they were perfectly rational and they were perfectly self-interested, could they desire anything other than could they desire huge amounts of suffering?
I would say that would be an irrational concept, the concept of a self-interested being that desires something other than
That's how I ground morality. Another sort of very like similar thing, like pretty similar argument is this is a modification of the veil of ignorance. Do you know about the idea of the Rawlsian veil of ignorance?
No.
Okay, well, the Rawlsian veil of ignorance says that the way you should act is you would act as if you were not sure who you would be in society. So if
Mhm.
I'm deciding whether or not to stab you, I should act as if I'm not sure if I would be me or you getting stabbed. And if I
Okay.
knew I had a 50-50 odds of being each of us, I would presumably not choose to stab you because I would
Got
have
it. Okay. Similar to like the
the idea
golden
that I
rule, but you put yourself in there along with them. Okay.
well, yeah, that's not the idea that I defend. It's just an idea that's sort of similar.
Okay.
So the argument is that.
But how do you get to the ought of that? I'm not sure.
Yeah. So I'll explain. So the argument is that so it is only possible for things that are good or bad to be encapsulated in the mind states of sentient creatures. Nothing can be, and that premise, I don't know that it's possible to like prove that premise, but I think if we sort of think about it, what it means to be moral, we'll come to the conclusion that a really beautiful tree would not matter if no one is ever there to look at the tree.
Sure, yeah, it wouldn't matter to anyone if there was no anyone for it to matter
Right.
to. Yeah.
So then if things that carry positive moral value are only able to be captured by conscious experience, then if we want to maximize the moral value in the universe, then we should act as if we experienced all conscious experience in the universe and tried to maximize the worthwhile conscious experience. And
Okay.
so,
wait, where do you get the premise of that? Like, where do you get that first premise?
well,
That's good to maximize this experience.
well, premise one, all good and bad is only possible. It's only possible to encapsulate things that are good and bad in the conscious experience of sentient beings.
Okay, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Premise.
Yeah, you can't observe something if there's no observer. Yeah.
Premise two. Thus, if we want to maximize the ratio of good to bad, we should act as if we experienced all experiences that are experienced by all conscious beings, and then act to maximize those good experiences that are experienced. Because you take the possible pool of experiences that could have value, and then you act to maximize the value from within those experiences.
I see.
And from that, you are a utilitarian because you try to maximize the well-being of everyone.
Okay, but how do you get that first kind of if statement in your second premise, where if it's best to maximize this good experience, we should do it? Like, I understand that logically follows, but how do we get to that it's good to maximize this experience in an objective sense, rather than just sort of that this is what we want?
Well, because objective good, as you agreed with premise one, is only possibly encapsulatable. That was an interesting word that I made up. Encapsulatable in the conscious experiences of sentient beings.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. I would agree with that.
And you experience, like, you act as if you were experienced all of that, and then try to maximize the desirable positive experiences of sentient beings.
Sure, but when I agree to that, I meant like by definition, this thing cannot exist, or this thing cannot be observed without the observer. You know, like the tree falls in the forest, nobody can hear the vibrations that it makes. But I don't understand how, like, just because I agreed that if this concept were to be, that it would require observers, that therefore we should now start observing it. Like, how do you get to there is this concept, and it necessitates that we do this thing? Where do we get that?
Well, the argument is, so if there are objective derivatives from experiencing every experience that could conceivably have value, i.e., if it would be from that initial state of experiencing all conscious experiences, if there are certain actions that would be rational and certain ones that would be irrational from that conscious state, and that conscious state encapsulates all that could have moral value and only that which could have moral value, then that proves objective morality.
Okay, but how do you get to the sort of this is the rational state? How do you get that?
I think that it's self-evident that if you experienced all that was experienced, certain actions would not be rational to partake from that initial state. So if you experience that,
wait. When you don't mean rational in the logical sense, you mean rational in the, like, this is how I achieve this goal sense. Like, you just wouldn't want that.
Well, I mean, like,
Like if you achieved good and bad, you'd want the good, or like pleasure and suffering, you'd want the pleasure, is what you're saying.
Yes, it would be from that state. It would be rational to desire the pleasure. It would be irrational to like jump in a furnace from that initial.
Well, I think that's a misrepresentation of rationality to say that just because I want something that makes it rational.
I don't think that just because you want something makes it inherently rational. But I think that if we experience everything that could experience conceivable value, there are some derivatives from that, some experiences that do not achieve value from that initial state.
They don't
One
achieve
of those would
value.
be jumping in a furnace.
Well, how are we achieving any value objectively? Like, do we have like a little point, like a scoreboard, and we say, hey, these ones gave me points and these ones didn't, so we go for them? Or is this like a subjective value, like, oh, I just valued that and I valued this, and so it's rational for me to go for this because I value this? Is that what you're saying? It's sort of a pragmatic morality.
Like, well, it is in some sense a pragmatic morality. Like utilitarianism is essentially pragmatically maximizing well-being.
Okay, but how do you get to obligation? How do you get to like objective obligation, or do you not?
If there are things that are objectively choice-worthy from that initial state, then those things are moral.
From the initial state being that I want pleasure and I don't want suffering.
No, from the initial state of you experience, all that is experienced.
Okay, so I want to be careful when you say it's that experience is moral. Is it moral from my own point of view, or is it moral objectively? Like if you were to have that experience, that would be a moral good all around. Like I would want you to experience that good thing. How do you get to that? Because I can see like if I experience this, I would say, hey, that's great, but I don't know how it would go. Okay, all right, it's great now that you would do that.
Well, in this case, they're one and the same because you are experiencing every experience of every sentient being.
Okay, so we're all just sort of meshed into this conglomerate of beings, and we all like how do we get there? What is that? Can you unpack that for me a little bit?
Well, yeah. So we get there for the purpose of the hypothetical to exist, because you have agreed that moral value is only possible. It can only be grounded in the experiences of sentient beings.
Yeah, so it wouldn't mean anything without
for this. You have one agent who experiences everything that's experienced by sentient beings, and to the extent that there are objective derivatives, objective actions that they could take that are more choice-worthy than others, then those actions objectively ought to be taken.
Well, objectively ought to be taken from that
they experience.
Wouldn't it be objectively from that point of view of this being that experiences everything? I don't see how it would be objective from the point of view of the people who aren't that being.
Well, no. If that being, from the state of being that being, being that being,
being the being, yeah.
If there are objective derivatives from that state of action X is better than action Y from that initial state.
How would that be an objective derivative?
Like,
just because you're experiencing everything, so it has to be objective because morality can exist outside of experience? Is that sort of the argument?
The argument, well, it's that because morality cannot exist outside of experiences, if there are certain things that could not be rationally pursued by an agent from that initial state, like if from that
I think I'm getting
it would be impossible to jump on a furnace, then that would prove that thing would not maximize the moral value, because a being who experiences everything that could have moral value with the goal of maximizing that moral value would try to avoid those experiences. It's just a metric for determining the moral value of actions.
Okay, so let me try to steelman this a little bit. It would be because morality kind of has no significance outside of experience. Suppose that there was a being that could see all experience of moral actions simultaneously. This being, the things that this being would want would be, because morality has no value outside of experience, and this being is experiencing everything, this being would essentially have the most valuable moral decree or moral experience, so to say, and then we could derive morality from that conglomerate of experience, this hypothetical concept of experiencing everything. Is that sort of the argument?
Yeah.
Like if something could experience everything, that thing would be the most good, and so we should act as if we're like one in experience, and we're trying to maximize that good. Essentially, is that sort of the?
Yeah.
Okay. My problem, I guess, with that is, how do you get from the? Because that makes sense, but how do you get from the obligation of that being who knows everything to the obligation of the derived beings? Or I would say derived beings, but sort of the derived. Like, why would I ascribe to that derived morality?
Because from that initial state,
Or like, why objectively is that an attribute of me, so to speak? Not like why ought I follow it. That's different, because if it's objective, I ought to follow it by definition. But like, how does that attribute apply to me? Like, just because there's this conglomerate concept of all experience, why should I follow that?
Because if it is ethical to maximize the experiences which could conceive, if moral value, if normative value is only able to be encapsulated behind, in terms of the experiences of sentient beings,
mm-hmm.
and our goal is to maximize the normative value in the universe,
mm-hmm.
to maximize the goodness in the universe.
Okay. But real quick, I understand where it's going, but how do you get that if? Why is that our goal? Why is our goal to maximize the goodness in the universe?
Well, I think morality is, like, sort of definitionally trying to make things better, trying to make things as good as they can be.
Because it sounds like there's a little bit of, like, I don't want to accuse you of, like, equivocation, but it sounds a little bit like we're taking this definition of good that's sort of just something that the mind's experience that we want, and then we're kind of transcending it up a layer almost. It's a transcendental. You're making a transcendental argument a little bit, and then saying, this is the ultimate good. This is the most good that could be experienced, and then we're kind of replacing that with objective good, like because this is what this concept of a mind would want if it knew everything. This is the objective good. I don't know how you get from, like, all informed good to objective good. Like, just because something under this all knowledge pretense would want this thing, how does that make that thing good objectively? Because
you have agreed that objective good is can only be captured by the experiences of sentient beings.
They can only be captured by it. Yeah.
Right, and it is moral to maximize based on what I think the definition of morality is. It is moral to maximize that which is good in the universe.
But how do you ground that without sort of begging the question and saying this thing
morality is trying to make things good? Like, I think that's just sort of what morality means.
Okay. So making things good, but how do you ground the things that are good? Is it if your grounding comes from subjective,
things that you would do from that initial state, because that initial state allows you to experiencing everything which could conceivably be good or bad, to the extent that there are things that are objectively, rationally worthy of pursuit from that initial state. Those things are objectively good.
Okay, but under that definition of objective morality, how do you get obligation? Because it sounds like we're redefining objective morality from this sort of ought that's put as an attribute on like the universe, and then is derived into these objects with moral agency. It sounds like we're replacing that with this more limited view of objective morality, where it's just sort of what we all would want if we knew all once, essentially.
No, objective.
Like, how do you get the authority for that?
That's not defined. So I'm not giving the definition of objective morality as what would you do if you experienced all that was experienced. My argument is that objective morality stems from maximizing goodness, maximizing that which is normatively good.
Okay, I'm with you so far, yeah, because goodness hasn't been defined yet.
What you would do from behind that initial state of experiencing everything else's, every experience of all sentient beings, that determines what experiences, that allows you to determine what actions maximize goodness in the universe.
Okay. But my
should act. So if the goal of A is to achieve, if the goal of A is to achieve B, A is morality, and B is maximizing goodness, and C allows you to determine how to achieve B, then acting the way you would under C is what you should do if you're trying to pursue A.
Okay, but
or abide by A and pursue B.
I'm having trouble getting to the like the sort of obligation part of morality, because it seems to me objective morality carries objective obligation, and what you're essentially saying is that it's only objective in the sense that it's objectively true that we would subjectively want these things.
No, it is objective. It is true that an action is objectively good in that it objectively makes the world better or worse. I don't think that we can.
Wait. Say that again.
Sure. So it is true that an action makes the world objectively better or worse.
Only if you can ground.
You have an obligation to make the world better.
Well, only if you can ground what you mean by better or worse objectively.
Yes, and I think to ground what is a better or worse objectively, given that you agree that things that are good or bad can only be grounded in the mind state of sentient beings, then if you experience the mind of all sentient beings, and then you act how you would from behind that initial position.
Sure, but the reason I agree to that
allow you to determine what actions are objectively good or bad.
Sure, but the reason that I agreed to that morality can only be grounded in the minds of objective beings is, I mean, obviously I believe in the existence of God, and so it's sort of that this would be the ultimate being that is imagining these things as good or bad. And so when we come in and we say, like, we sort of take this definition, and then that things that exist, or this definition that morality must exist in the mind of something or it has no value, and then we use that to reason to this higher obligation. I'm just not seeing how we get there. Like, how do we get from I can't understand this without understanding it to, because I understand this, I ought to follow this. But like, you can also say, ice cream is like preferable, but I can't understand liking ice cream without like a certain mind and without certain experience. But how do we reason to, just because, like, if you knew every flavor of ice cream, that you would like one ice cream more? How do we reason that to, I ought to eat this flavor of ice cream rather than others? It just seems to me like, just because you would want something in a certain condition, and this condition is like a transcended condition where you have all knowledge, that doesn't necessarily, I don't see how that would necessarily mean that you ought to follow this thing.
Well, so if there were an objectively best ice cream flavor, we would determine that by saying, if you were a being who wanted to maximize the value that you get from ice cream, and you experienced all the different possible ice cream flavors, which one would you? Is there one that it would objectively be rational to prefer over the others? And
sure, but with that, I don't think that would make it an objectively,
because they're like different beings who have different preferences. They have different ice cream flavors that are the best for them.
Yeah, but I don't even think that the concept of an objectively best ice cream flavor is coherent. Like, I don't think we could make an ice cream flavor that obligates you to eat it, as opposed to other ice cream flavors. Like, I don't think if we quantified this and we said if we knew all human knowledge, cookies and cream would just be the objectively most pleasurable ice cream, that when you walk into an ice cream store and you order peanut butter, everybody's going to go, oh, like, look at that guy, he's doing something wrong from an objective ice cream standpoint.
I think that there are objective derivatives. Like, you can have it be the case that, given my preferences about ice cream, it is objectively better for me to get cookies and cream than some other type of ice cream, because
you could say that. You could say, given your preferences, sure.
Right. So my claim is that well-being transcends preferences and is just rationally desirable, independent of people's preferences.
Don't you justify that based off the definition of a self-interested being?
I think. But
what's that?
We've been talking for like 2 hours, so
we have. Yeah, I do need to wrap it up too. That's fair.
But we can keep talking for the next few minutes. Okay. So, sorry, what were you saying?
Well, I'm just saying, like, don't you define this morality as being logically necessary as derived from the self-interested being just by definition? So had you come along and say that just because you're interested in this, it wouldn't matter, essentially? Like, how do you get there?
Because I think that all sentient beings, I think that it would be impossible for a sentient being to rationally have a preference for something other than well-being.
You think it would be, but is this a rational sort of constraint on them, or is this a rational constraint on the third party observer? Like, it's irrational to describe this, or it's irrational for them to do this? It's a rational constraint on them. Okay, see, I don't know how you get there.
Well, do you think that it would be that
I don't think rationality is subject to your whims. I think facts don't care about your feelings. So
I don't think so either. But I don't. Do you think that it would be possible to rationally, like, for a egoist to rationally, could an egoist rationally jump into a fire?
Could an egoist rationally jump into a fire?
Yeah,
it depends what you mean by rationally. Like, there's no logical irrationality about the event of him doing that. Like, sure, I can conceive of an egoist jumping in a fire. He would just be a really bad egoist. Like, he would be doing something contrary to his nature, but I can conceive of a person.
He would be doing something, right. To the extent that egoists care about things that are normatively good for themselves,
sure.
And egoists care about things that produce well-being for themselves.
But you wouldn't say an egoist jumping in a fire is an egoist who is doing something that he himself, like, he's not following the laws of logic. He is acting like his rationale is off. You would say our rationale is off if we conceived of a perfect egoist that jumps into a fire.
Well, either one. If an egoist jumped into a fire, they would be acting irrationally in the pursuit of their goals. And
but that's the important qualifier, is in the pursuit of their goals, because that sounds like a subjective goal now. It sounds like it's objectively true, but only so long as you're supposing these subjective goals. And so it kind of begs the question, how do you get these goals?
But their goal is to pursue that which is good for themselves.
Sure, but subjectively good for themselves. Like, there's nothing objectively good about.
Well, no. If there are mind independent claims about what an egoist would rationally do from that state, then those claims are objective from a normative perspective.
Well, okay, but I only agree with that so long as we're saying that it's rational from the perspective of the egoist. Or I'm sorry, it's rational from the perspective of the person describing the egoist, not the egoist himself.
Wait, so could an egoist be perfectly rational in jumping into a fire if it was not conducive to their well-being? Like, if no more horrible fate awaited them, they just jumped into a fire for no reason. Could they?
What do you mean by could he be rational? Are you talking about, like, his state of ontological existence is rational? Or are you talking about the mental process going through his head? Could it be rational?
Like, could the egoist be acting rationally as they jump into a fire?
He could, I suppose.
Wait, so you think that a rational egoist could...
Well, hold on. Not the same as a rational egoist. I think we're equivocating rational.
Well, you think that an egoist could be perfectly rational. Thank you, person in the chat who said I'm so smart. I appreciate that. So, could you think that an egoist an egoist action of jumping into a fire could be a perfectly rational action, even to the extent that it's not good for achieving their long-run goals?
From their perspective, it could be.
Sorry, not the extent that it's achieving their long. But you think that if an egoist goal is to maximize that which is good for themselves, and jumping into a fire causes enormous amounts of suffering, doesn't create any more well-being or anything. Like, it's not like they're jumping into a fire to prevent themselves from being ripped to death by a pack of hyenas. I understand the hypothetical, but I think who desires things that is good for themselves in the pursuit of things that are good for themselves could rationally desire to jump into a fire. It could be rational for them to jump into a fire pit.
Sure, I think it's an equivocation of when we say something is rational. If I say, like, for example, you're a rational person because you invoke the laws of logic, and you do it quite well, that's not the same as saying that, like, my description of you is rational. Like if I said that you were a person who existed and also not existed, that concept of you is not a rational you. Like it's not a rational concept of you.
Sure.
So when we're saying the egoist jumping into the fire, that's not a rational concept, because assuming there's a perfect egoist who would never jump into a fire, somebody who would not jump into a fire, jumping into a fire it's an incoherent concept.
Well,
but from the perspective of the egoist doing this thing, I don't think that he necessarily has to have his like who his identity and what his ultimate desire is in mind in order to do something and then be considered rational, because that would suppose that rationality relies on your goal rather than some sort of objective standard of logic.
Sure. So the claim that I am making is that to the extent that an egoist is attempting to achieve their goal of maximizing that which is good for themselves, it could not be the case that it is good for themselves to jump into a fire, independent of their preferences. If they want to jump into a fire, and they think that that is the best way to achieve their goals about pursuing that which is good for themselves, and jumping into a fire causes them immense suffering and does not increase their well-being, they would be mistaken.
Sure, I would agree with you that they would be mistaken, but I wouldn't say that they are reasoning in an irrational way, because that kind of imports the idea that the reason that they don't want to jump into a fire is because of like something that is objectively reasonable, something that follows the laws of logic. When in our hypothetical, they don't necessarily have that grounding. They just sort of don't want this.
Yeah, but
right?
in the pursuit of goals, if you do a thing that is not conducive to your pursuit of those goals, from the perspective of attempting to pursue those goals, that is irrational if that is your goal.
Well, I wouldn't say it's irrational. I don't think something can be subjectively irrational in that sense. I would say because rational means basically to follow the laws of logic. So if what you're saying is you're invoking the laws of logic in an improper way in order to say this is how I get to the goals, then yes, that would be irrational. But if what you're saying is that you're just doing something that doesn't follow your goals, and you're not necessarily like supposing that the way you get to deciding to do that is through a misuse of logic, then it wouldn't be you behaving irrationally because you're not misusing logic.
I think we have different definitions of rationality, but so
yeah.
Given that, to rephrase, so if they wanted to jump into a fire, and it would massively increase their suffering, it would not increase their well-being at all, would their act of jumping into a fire be an act that is objectively not conducive to their goals?
Yeah, it would be not conducive to the goals. I would agree with that.
Their goal is to maximize that which is good.
Yeah. My problem though is that when you say that it's
claim that
I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
That proves that suffering is not conducive to that suffering is antithetical to goodness.
It proves that suffering is antithetical to goodness.
Desire things that are for yourselves, and you experience suffering for yourself, and it moves you away from that goal, and that proves that suffering is sort of the opposite of goodness.
How do you get to suffering as the opposite of objective goodness? Because so far it seems like you've only proved that I don't want it.
Well, because in this case, to the extent that it is impossible for one with the goal of achieving good things that if they think that jumping into a fire in this case would be conducive to their goals, that is mistaken, then that is a factual claim that they are wrong about. To the extent
they're incorrect.
A factual claim that proves that there's an objective phenomenon and that suffering is objectively not conducive to their goals of maximizing.
Sure. I would agree with that. It's objectively not conducive to their goals, but how do you reach? Because it's not conducive to their goals, it's not good.
That which is good for themselves.
Wait.
Not good suffering diminishes their ability to pursue that which is good for them. Suffering for themselves diminishes that which is good for themselves. Which proves that suffering is not good.
Can you kind of take me through that again? Because I was with you up until a point.
Sure. Suffering is not good. Suffering is not conducive to their goals. I would agree. It's objectively not conducive to the goals. Yeah. So sure.
If your goal is to not suffer,
Objectively, their goal is to maximize that which is good for themselves.
Wait. Objectively good or subjectively good? Like good for themselves? You mean good for themselves,
Their
not
goal
good
is
for
to
themselves.
pursue that which is objective. That if they're trying to maximize that which is true, like objectively good for themselves.
Hmm. Wait. It is objectively good, or it is
It
objectively true that it's subjectively good for themselves.
No, it is objectively good.
It's
for
objectively
themselves.
good.
No.
How do you get that?
Well, because to the extent that a self-interested agent
Mhm.
cares about things which are good for themselves or not good for themselves, to the extent that you can say that they are mistaken about that which is good for themselves, then that proves that it is an objective claim, because you cannot be mistaken about subjective preferences. You cannot be mistaken
I understand.
that chocolate
understand,
ice
yeah.
cream is like tastes nice.
But that doesn't sound like objective good. It sounds like it's objectively true that it's subjectively good.
No, it is objectively good to the extent that when someone does not pursues its inverse, they are factually mistaken that is the best way to pursue that which is good.
To pursue their goal.
No, well, but their goal is to achieve that which is good for themselves.
I agree with you on the objective truth aspect,
that
but
is
how do you get to
way
the objective
to achieve
morality
that which is
aspect?
good.
How do you get to, because it's objectively true that this would achieve their subjective goal or their subjective image of good, that makes this objectively good? It seems like it's only objectively good for them, which would be subjectively good ultimately.
You are saying that they would be mistaken about that thing being good for themselves.
Good for themselves, yeah.
Existence of some objective phenomenon, because you cannot be mistaken about subjective phenomenon.
Okay, I would agree. Yeah. But it's objective. The phenomenon is it being good for themselves, which is a subjective thing.
But it's also the pursuit of well-being for themselves. So then if the things cancel out, then you get well-being is synonymous with good.
That sounds like equivocation, like well-being for themselves, like as in like pleasure, which is a subjectively good thing.
If I say I only desire A and I only desire B,
mm-hmm.
then if for a contradiction not to arise, A has to be B.
Okay, yeah, that's true.
So then that proves objective morality.
I don't understand how you get to I only desire objective good, because that would require objective knowledge, would it not? Like, it sounds to me like it's a pursuit of this thing that I subjectively view as objectively good.
No, it's objectively good because you have agreed that if to the extent that they think that something is good for themselves, that they could be mistaken about that claim.
They could be mistaken about that claim. Okay, yeah. Do you not believe that?
No, I do believe that. The fact that you could be mistaken about whether or not something is good for yourself proves that the question of whether or not something is good for yourself is an objective question.
I agree. Yeah. But good for yourself is the important qualifier there, because it can only be good for yourself subjectively.
For yourselves cancel out. So like, to lay this out logically,
mm-hmm.
A rational self-interested agent only desires that which is good for themselves. A rational agent only desires that which produces well-being for themselves / avoids suffering for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, that which is good is the same as that which produces well-being / avoids suffering.
I understand the syllogism, but how do you get
logically? But which premises do you disagree with?
Well, I disagree with. It seems like I agree with the premises only so long as this being is desiring things which are objectively good for themselves, and for themselves being a subjective attribute.
Well, no, for themselves is not so.
Is this a subject? Is this, when you say good for yourself, is this like an objective good being applied to you, or is this you deciding for yourself that this thing is good? Right? Like, maple syrup is good for me. When I say that, I mean, like, to me, it's good. I don't mean that it's objectively healthy for me, or good in some objective sense for me. Like, the good isn't being brought onto me. I'm bringing it in and I'm calling it good.
Expressing that it is objectively good.
Okay, so then I don't agree with that.
Well, but you have agreed with that, because you have agreed that in order for you to say that someone is wrong about a preference, you have to say that there is an objective right answer about what is good or bad for an agent. To the extent
no, you can just say that it's objectively wrong, that they believe that it's right or wrong for themselves. Like, if I like cookies and cream ice cream, and I say that I consider that to be the objective moral, or I consider that to be the good, and then I say like this cup of peanut butter ice cream is good, I would be objectively wrong because it wouldn't be good in my own standard because it's not cookies and cream. It's objectively not in line with my desires.
The standard is that which is good for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay, but is this is good?
And
this is good outside of me, or is this good that comes from me?
It's good. It is that which is good for you.
Good, right? But which usage of good for me? Because as I've explained, there's sort of two ways to go about it.
Well, that which, that
objectively is good.
From your perspective, from the perspective of
from my
perspective, that which is rational for a self-interested agent to pursue.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's a subjective desire.
No, if there are objective derivatives, if there are objective things that a self-interested agent would pursue or would not pursue, such that we can say that if a self-interested agent pursues certain things, they are mistaken factually about that which is best for themselves, which you have agreed with, then there is objective morality.
Sure. But is it objectively true that this is subjectively good for them? Or is this objectively true that it is objectively good for them? As in, like, there's a standard beyond them of that which is good.
There is a standard beyond them of that which is good for them.
Of that which is good for them. Okay. And where do we get this standard? It's not derived from them. It's derived beyond them.
We get the standard from your agreement that we can have truth claims about what is good for them or not. I.e., you have agreed that to the extent that they think jumping in a fire pit is good for them, they are mistaken. That proves the existence of some external objective truth about what is good for them versus not good for them.
But if I said that jumping in the pool is objectively good for me, but my desire is to never get wet or something, then that would prove that I'm mistaken about like my pursuit of this subjective goal, and it's objectively true that I'm mistaken. That wouldn't prove that my goal is objectively good. It would prove that I'm objectively pursuing this goal.
In this case, their goal, I'm not, in this premise, I'm not saying that the things that are good for them are objectively good, right? What I'm
You're not saying that.
Is that,
okay,
we can derive that the things that are good for them, those things are sort of with the other premises of like that which is good for them is synonymous with that which produces well-being for them, which proves that well-being is good. In the other premises, we have the ability to derive that in the other premises, the first set of premises proves that which that there are objective right and wrong answers about what is good for them. Then the later premises prove that the objective right answers to what is good or bad for them allow us to ground objective morality.
Okay, see, I agree with that first premise, but only so long as we're saying that it's objectively right or wrong in the context of this subjective thing. Like when you say good for them, you're not saying objectively good for them. You're saying
I am saying objectively good for them because, again, you have said that to the extent that they can be mistaken about what is good or bad for them, then that proves that the question of what is good or bad for them is an objective question because you cannot be mistaken about subjective things.
Sure. But what's good for them is a subjective descriptor. That's what I was agreeing to. I wasn't agreeing that it's objectively just good. I mean, like, it's objectively true that it's subjectively good for them. That's what I'm saying. Like, ice cream is subjectively good for me, and if I were to eat something other than ice cream, it would be objectively true that that thing is not subjectively good for me. Now, it wouldn't be objectively true from a different subjective standard, say like the health of my body, then that wouldn't be objectively true. But if we're talking about a subjective standard of just, I think Oreo ice cream is good, then from that subjective standard, it would be objectively true that I'm mistaken by eating anything else.
No, but in this case, we're not presupposing any other set of rules other than the rule that they pursue that which is good for them. We're not saying they pursue that which is healthy. We're saying they pursue that which is good for them. The other which you have agreed with proves that if there are objective derivatives of that which is good for them, those things that they rationally desire that are objectively good for them, the universalization of that allows us to derive objective morality. So then if it can be proven that it is rational for a self-interested agent to desire certain things, such that some preferences of self-interested agents, you can say that they a self-interested agent to the extent that they desire certain things, they are the thing that they are desiring, they are objectively incorrect. That is objectively good for them.
Okay,
but it is objective morality, and it is a utilitarian one.
Okay, it's an interesting argument. It sounds to me like it's more equivocation in that we're taking this thing that is objectively true about goodness, and we're sort of transforming it into it's objectively good, and then using that to reason to the conclusion that desire is objectively good. I feel like in this way we could conceive of anything. Like how do you answer this problem if I were to switch it to anything else and say that like ice cream is objectively good for me, or is subjectively good for me, and then reason along the same lines. Like why is this one desire objectively good, and any other desire that we conceive in a hypothetical such as this, why is that one not also objectively true, or are they all?
Work for the reasons that are explained in the other premises. So remember, the next premise is that so the first premise is it's that a self-interested agent only exclusively desires only rationally desires that which is good for them. They also only desire that which produces well-being for them / avoids suffering for them.
So could a self-interested agent desire ice cream if it's a self-interested ice cream desiring agent?
I've just finished the explanation. So
yeah.
And then we use that to say, so then the conclusion of that is that if you only pursue A and you only pursue B, then A and B are identical. Oh, he left. Okay. Sure, I'll finish my explanation. So the argument would be that the difference with ice cream is that ice cream is not the only thing that a rational self-interested agent would desire. Even if they would sometimes desire it, it's not the only thing that they would desire. And only the quantifier only is what establishes that the two things are synonymous. Because it's if you only desire A and you only desire B, then A and B are synonymous, or that at least proves that either A or B is a subset of the other, and whichever one of them is the only thing that is desire that is worthy of pursuit. So that proves that well-being is desirable. Ice cream is not intrinsically desirable because a self-interested agent would have the capacity to not desire well-being. It's not the only thing that they desire. So that's the argument. I don't know where he went, but thank you for watching. To the extent that you watch, you should like, comment, and subscribe. Yeah, it was a good discussion, right?